Hello. Okay. Good afternoon, colleagues, distinguished guests, members of the Diplomatic Corps, scholars, practitioners, and friends. My name is Musa Ngcele, and I'm the Academic Director at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. On behalf of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this public seminar on coalition governance. We are grateful to the Mapungubwe Institute of Strategic Reflection, together with the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, for bringing this dialogue to Cape Town and for inviting the school to host the public session here at the Graduate School of Business. It is a privilege for us to provide a home for a conversation of this importance. Let me acknowledge our colleagues at MISTRA under the leadership of Mr. Joel Nechitenze for the leadership and intellectual work behind both the closed roundtable held a few days ago and today's public engagement. Thank you as well to our partners from the Kingdom of the Netherlands, our guest speaker, Professor Bert Koenders, facilitators and panelists, and to everyone here from political parties, government, civil society, academia, business, the media, and the students and young people present. In addition, I would like to acknowledge people who have joined us online for this seminar. This exchange matters precisely because it is comparative. The Netherlands has lived coalition politics as institutional routine. South Africa is learning coalition politics in real time, under pressure, and with very high expectations placed on the state. The dialogue, therefore, runs both ways. And if I may briefly situate the school, the Nelson Mandela School exists to strengthen the practice of governance in real institutional settings. We work with public leaders across the African continent on practical challenges of governing in complex political environments. Coalition governance is now one of the conditions under which public leadership in South Africa will either succeed or fail. And for that reason, this conversation sits squarely within our mission. We meet at a particular moment in South Africa. A week ago, the President delivered the State of the Nation address framed around a simple idea that the country's strength ultimately lies in what we can achieve together, even when we differ. The speech moved from the women of 1956 to the youth of 1976 to the Constitution of 1996, a reminder that our democracy has always been forged in contestation rather than unanimous agreement. But it also spoke directly to present anxieties: weak local government in many areas, pressure for jobs and opportunity, the threat of organized crime, and the daily frustration citizens experience when the state does not work as it should. Coalition governance, therefore, arrives not as a technical political arrangement, but as the governing form through which South Africa must now address these pressures. And we are entering a local election year. Parties will campaign, sometimes against partners with whom they govern. That is normal in a coalition era, but it requires a political maturity that systems do not automatically possess. South Africa has entered a political phase, a new political phase. For 3 decades, governance largely operated under conditions of single-party dominance, even as society itself was plural and negotiated. Today, the political system has begun to resemble the society it governs, fragmented, diverse, and negotiated in real time. So what is this seminar meant to do? First, it is not to decide whether coalitions are good or bad. Coalitions can widen representation and accountability, and they can also slow decision-making and blur responsibility. The real question is to debate and explore what makes them functional. Second, it is to learn. In countries like the Netherlands, coalition governance rests on institutional habits, agreements about process, discipline, and compromise. South Africa is still building those habits. The question before us is whether a political system historically organized around decisive mandates can adapt to negotiated authority. Can parties compete and govern simultaneously? And can citizens recognize legitimacy when power is visibly shared rather than concentrated? Third, it is to keep the citizens in view. Coalition politics easily becomes a conversation about offices and arrangements. But legitimacy will ultimately depend on whether life improves, whether services work, whether municipalities function, whether economic opportunity expands, and whether corruption and violence are confronted. Finally, this session opens the conversation to the public sphere, moving from institutional mechanics to democratic understanding. A country does not only learn democracy at its founding, it learns democracy again whenever its governing form changes. We hope today contributes to that learning. With that, let me once again welcome you and thank you for being here. We now move over to the opening remarks session of the section of the program. We have two speakers that I will briefly introduce. Firstly, Dr. Reneva Fourie, who will deliver the opening remarks and will be followed by Ambassador Joanne Doornevaart. Briefly, Dr. Fourie has over 20 years of professional experience in governance, development, and security within the South African government and the broader African continent. She currently sits on MISTRA's Board of Governors and also serves as a Central Committee and Politburo member of the South African Communist Party. Ambassador Joanne Doornevaart is of the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands and will be also covering Botswana in her talk, Eswatini, Lesotho, and Namibia. Ambassador Doornevaart has been Ambassador of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to South Africa since 2003. So for now, I will invite Dr. Reneva Fourie over to you. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Your Excellency Ambassador Joanne Doornevaart, Dr. Musa Nele, members of the Diplomatic Corps, the University of Cape Town fraternity, distinguished panelists and speakers, participants present and those online. On behalf of MISTRA, I would like to say how pleased we are to be co-hosting this high-level public seminar on coalition governance in South Africa and the Netherlands. We gather just days, as Dr. Moos had indicated, we gather just days after President Ramaphosa delivered his State of the Nation address, reaffirming the need for South Africans across the political spectrum to work together in pursuit of growth, social progress, democratic stability, and the well-being of our people. We also gather one day after the passing of Reverend Jesse Jackson, a towering figure in the global struggle for civil rights, human dignity and justice, and who has used coalitions effectively to drive change. Historically, coalitions that had characterized South Africa's democratic journey were driven by a clear sense of purpose. the strategic alliance between the ANC, the South African Communist Party, and the South African Congress of Trade Unions, now called COSATU, used united national ideological and worker struggles around the common goal of resisting colonialism and apartheid. Led by that Congress alliance and guided by the Freedom Charter, organizations within the United Democratic Front, another coalition, and later the Mass Democratic Movement, coordinated their efforts to achieve our liberation. During the negotiation period, the Women's National Coalition ensured that gender equality and women's rights were integral to the democratic settlement. These purpose-driven coalitions shaped the first government of national unity in 1994, established under the interim constitution to secure peace, stability, and broad participation. It enabled the Constituent Assembly to craft the Constitution, which now enters its 30th year. The outcomes of the 2024 general election necessitated the re-emergence of the government of national unity. While the sense of crisis that characterized the early days of the current government of national unity subsided, many of the questions that fueled the debates then remain relevant today. Should coalitions be formally regulated within the political system? How inclusive must coalitions be to ensure that governance prioritizes citizens' needs, voices, and rights? What mechanisms can be put in place to resolve deadlocks between coalition partners? Do coalition arrangements genuinely improve governance outcomes, or do they undermine effectiveness and accountability? How do coalition partners affect party mandates? How do coalition politics affect party mandates and the ability of parties to retain independence while serving the public interest? MISTRA's research into coalition politics spans over a decade, led in large part by Professor Susan Boyson, who joins us among today's experts. Beyond books, articles, conferences, and policy briefs, MISTRA produces its flagship Coalitions Barometer. The 2021 to 2023 edition examined coalition politics at the local sphere between the 2021 elections and mid-2023, while the 2025 edition documents emerging patterns and trends across national, provincial, and local governance, providing insights into how coalitions affect people and democratic participation. MISTRA's work represents one of many contributions to understanding coalition governance, and we value the opportunity to share knowledge and experiences, including insights from international experts. In this regard, we warmly acknowledge Professor Bert Koenders, a former minister in two coalition governments, whose experience will ground us in real-world coalition practice and offer an important comparative perspective that will significantly strengthen the analytical depth of our discussions. It is important to note that formal political structures are not the only ones that shape national discourse. Civil society organizations play a critical role in these debates. We hope that today's discussions will illuminate how civil society can engage with coalition politics, hold governments accountable, and ensure that governance remains anchored in the rights, interests, and everyday realities of our people. This gathering should also reflect on the interplay between domestic and international politics. Shifting global power dynamics and heightened international tensions place new pressures on democratic systems and multilateral cooperation, with domestic coalitions often reflecting these strains. These dynamics raise important questions about how national sovereignty can be safeguarded while advancing international law, global peace, and equitable development. MISTRA remains committed to fostering informed debate and constructive dialogue. With local government elections expected within the next 12 months, this seminar provides a timely opportunity to reflect on the pertinent questions confronting coalition governance while ensuring that it remains purpose-driven and people-centered. Thank you for joining us today. We're looking forward to your inputs and views, and I now invite Ambassador Joanne Doornwald to the podium.
Thank you. Okay, so program director, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this public dialogue, Navigating Coalition Governance in South Africa. We meet at an important moment in South Africa's democratic journey. Coalition governance is no longer confined to local municipalities. It has become a feature of national politics. And this shift invites serious reflection. How do we govern effectively in a fragmented political landscape? How do we balance compromise with principle? And how do we ensure coalitions deliver stability, accountability, and tangible results for its citizens? These are questions that we in the Netherlands have had to deal with for over a century. Coalition governance has been our norm, embedding a political culture that values negotiation, consensus, and structured agreements. And we are still learning. Next week, we will see the kickoff of our first minority government. And as the Netherlands, we want to share our experiences and learn from fellow democracies like South Africa. And this is why I am proud to co-host this event with MISTRA. I'm glad that Professor Bert Koenders, a Dutch academic and former minister, my former minister, is here and able to join us today to share his experiences and perspectives. And while our contexts differ significantly, both our countries are grappling with questions of political fragmentation and public trust. And I think some of my colleagues here in the room will agree that coalitions are inherently complex. They require dialogue, discipline, and a willingness to work across the ideological divides. And when managed well, they can deepen democracy. But when mismanaged, they can produce instability and erode public confidence. So today's conversation is meant to be an honest exchange about what works and what does not, and what lessons we can learn. I want to conclude with that, and I encourage all of you to engage boldly and critically, because democracy is strengthened when ideas are tested openly and respectfully. And with that, I very warmly welcome you all and look forward to an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Dr. Fourie and to you, Ambassador Doornwald, for setting the scene for today's conversation and for grounding us in both the South African perspectives and the perspectives from the Netherlands. I now hand over the program to Dr. Sandy Africa, who will guide the rest of the discussion and introduce our guest speaker, Professor Bert Koenders, in conversation with Dr. Lawrence Karumba. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ngcele, and greetings to everybody. It's a great pleasure to be the program director for the rest of the proceedings. Thank you also to our distinguished speakers for the opening remarks. You have a program before you, and I'll be guiding you through it as we transition from one stage to the next. But we are going to start off not with a keynote address, as sometimes happens in seminars, but rather with a conversation, very much in the spirit of what we want to do today. And this conversation is going to be between Dr. Lawrence Korumba, who is a researcher in the humanities faculty at MISTRA, a political scientist who also specializes, besides international relations, in the study of democracy, the politics of coalitions and governance in general. Lawrence will be in conversation with Professor Bert Koenders, who's a professor of peace, justice and security at Leiden University. As mentioned, he has actually served under coalition governments too in the Netherlands, and he's written extensively and shared his experience in different fora about coalitions. I might mention that he also has extensive diplomatic experience, having served as Under Secretary General of the United Nations and head of UN peacekeeping operations in Cote d'Ivoire and Mali during his career. So I'd like to invite the two up to these lovely seats to begin the conversation, after which we will have the opportunity to engage with Prof. Koenders. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks, Professor Koenders. It's good to continue our discussion about coalitions. So, I think you have, I mean, your country in general has a lot of experience with coalition government. I think you were saying that the Netherlands, for something like 100 years, has been having coalition governments. I understand. And certainly since World War II, every single government has been a non-minority government. So, for us, on the other hand, this is still a little bit new, especially at the national level. And I think for me, for a lot of people, it sometimes almost seems a bit surreal. Like you have this election campaign, you have political parties that are out there, they're competing, they're attacking each other, they're saying, you know, oh, you know, if our opponents win the election, it's going to be a complete disaster and you must vote against them. Then the election happens, nobody secures a majority, and now you have to work together. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that? You know, based on your experience as a politician, you know, what's it like in the room where it happens? Sort of to quote Hamilton.
The room where it happens. Well, first of all, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. And what I would like to say is, with a lot of humility as well, in my country at the moment, coalition politics is in crisis. Although we've done it for 100 years, we've had 4 governments in the last 8 years. I don't only go into those examples because sometimes a coalition government has to break up. And if it's very often, then it's not very positive for the way that the electorate looks at us and in making agreements. But we have a long history, that's correct. Very quickly, maybe, without getting too much in history, the Netherlands has always been a country of minorities. And historically, we had in our building of coalitions after the Second World War, when the country was destroyed, there was a system of social democrats, different Christian parties, and to a certain extent a smaller liberal party always were used to follow the rules of coalition governments. At that time, we have to realize it was very elite-oriented. There's a famous book by Professor Leibhardt, some of you might have read it, that basically said, in Holland started the pillarized system. You had the elites working together, they made a deal. They made sure that there was not really any issue that would completely go against the vital interests of another party. That is a possibility as well, but there was sort of in those discussions, we know that each of you have vital interests, that if we go into neglecting those, you have a problem. But it was an elite-oriented coalition, there's no doubt about it. I would say fast forward after many years of functioning coalition governments, I would say maybe not unlike South Africa, although we are very, very different countries. You see in the electorate, of course, a non-acceptance of elite politics. That's already for 20, 30 years like that, and very understandably so. Secondly, a fragmentation of the political system. So many, many more political parties. We have now 15 or 16. And if you get a large degree of fragmentation, the risk is actually that each of those parties become rather inward-looking. I heard here the term party vultures. They become sometimes more important if you have small parties that want to show, even if they have only a few seats in the coalition, that they can govern. And therefore you see in the last couple of years that coalition formation has been more difficult. What is the way we look at it? I think it's both an issue of how you build a coalition, how you form it. Secondly, how you define the risks of your coalition. But most importantly, I think, is the culture of coalition politics. If I go very quickly in those three, and I'm sure they're very different from here. I know that they're very different from here. And therefore I would never say adapt what we did, because, you know, situations are very different. But I think on the first part, it's important to know that party platforms are quite detailed from each party. It's not only about what we would like in general, it's very, very defined in terms of health policy, economic policy, and so on and so forth. So voters know more or less, I'm not sure they all read the manifestos, but they know more or less with a certain degree of precision what is the party platform. The second, I think, which is important to know is that when a government is formed, and the leadership in our country is the parliament. It's not like you have the president, which is a fundamental difference, I think. And that means basically the formation process starts with eliminating parties, not with incorporating them, because you want to have cohesiveness in the government. That doesn't always work. And I've been part of a government that administered and governed with our ideological opposite. And actually that coalition worked very well. Was more stable than the coalition where we had much less differences of opinion. So coalitions, there are no fixed rules for it, but I would say make sure that the formation process is something where you take some time. I think you have 2 weeks, we do it for months and months, which is not very attractive, I think. But it's important to realize that those agreements go further than general principles. They basically say, what are the priorities of each country? How are we going to finance it? How are we going to plan for risks? And how do we then, I think you call it a clearinghouse, how do we actually deal with those risks? I think that's an important point, how to do that. And we believe very much that's not so much in legislation, it's about how the government is actually organized. So you have a pretty detailed government agreement. You have different parties who will prepare themselves, each Council of Ministers meeting of that week, to more or less ensure that there will be agreement on the Friday itself. The Friday is our council, the day of our council meetings. And also make sure that if something goes wrong or might go wrong, that you prepare it early on. That's one. Second, I said about some of the conventions. This is maybe the most important, and I see how interesting it's right here now I mean, I'm very excited how this happens here in the Government of National Unity, post-apartheid, post-freedom, now for the first time going into a coalition. And normally you would say the coalitions like you have right now are very different from ours. Some are in and out at the same time. It's not always clear if there's a consensus in the government. That's in the Netherlands impossible. If you don't agree, if one minister doesn't agree with a policy, you might already have a government crisis. So that preparation of risks is very important. So you need to think through not only in terms of money and budget and priorities. I think it's very important in my own experience that the government has a vision. Because we can talk about endless mechanisms, and they are important. The devil is in the details. How do you prepare a new government? What are the risks? Who is deciding on those? Do you put them on paper or not? How do you meet with your junior ministers on this? Do they all feel included? That's important. But as important is realizing that coalition government is not campaigning with another, campaigning through government. You really have to realize if you want to perform in this country, I guess, on unemployment, restructuring of the economy, even if you have different views on this, you have to realize that you have to make sure for your voters in the next 2 years that the colors are green and not red. I think that's very important.
Let me ask, what do you think how do you think about the importance of formal institutions versus the human element? Because, on the one hand, as political scientists, we look at things like, how detailed is the coalition agreement, what is the dispute mechanism resolution, but then, we were previously in our previous session, it was said, well, things like norms, culture, emotional self-regulation of the people who are making decisions, that is actually what determines coalition success. What do you think?
Well, maybe it's an easy answer, but it's both. It is really both. You need strong institutions that define what is an institution. It's a social contract, in fact. It's a contract how you work together and how you make sure that there is a certain amount of sustainability in it. That's why I think that institutions are key. It's not that they cannot change, that they couldn't differ. I see in the last couple of years when we have more fragmentation, that also our conventions and our institutions are changing in terms of how they prepare governments. But I think it's really both. Probably the culture is more important, but let's be open about it. If you just talk about culture and you have to be nice to each other and understand there is compromise, it becomes also very difficult because each of our parties is accountable. I think that's the third element I didn't mention yet, but maybe the most important. You have to realize that you don't do it only for a game between parliamentarians, ministers, and the leadership of the parties. It is in the end the voters. And we try to do that, and I'm not sure we're always very convincing in that. But in the formation of the government process, for instance, I was in one government. You can doubt if it was successful or not, that procedure. But we made sure, first of all, that independent civil servants gave us the facts and the figures, so that they were not politicized. Every party knew, and I mean, nothing is completely impartial, but just the economic facts, the social facts, the crime figures, everything, that has to go in a formation process. It's institutionally organized. So each party has a similar basis from what it wants to reach its policies. That's absolutely key, I think, by an independent civil servant. I think that's important. Second, the constitution remains absolutely key. I hope you will remain to have that. It's a very, very strong constitution you have in South Africa. I think everybody, I was yesterday going here to the museum, saw Albie Sachs, who I know from my time that I worked for peacekeeping operations in Mozambique. This is such a strong thing. Don't go away from all stuff. Institutions count, but make sure that you realize that in the way you implement policies, you relate to the spirit of compromise. And that is become very difficult in our country. That's why we can learn also from you, but I think you have similar tendencies here as well. Do you really want to share the burden and share control? You can say, okay, the biggest party could say, we want to make sure that if we take a decision, all of us are responsible for it. But then obviously the other party will have to say, yes, but then we want to have control and unanimity at the end of the day. That is a struggle I think is still going on in South Africa, which I understand. This is a transitional arrangement and you will probably keep having coalitions in the future. But again, I would say institutions, practices, objectified figures, and last but not least, ensure that there is a relationship with your civil society, with your people. We did, in that cabinet I was talking about, and again, I'm not sure it was that successful, but we had 100 days. So with our new government agreement, the coalition agreement, we went 100 days to everybody in the country, the municipalities, the unions, the employers' organizations. Because the illusion of politics these days is that if you have a government agreement and you have the right procedures, that somehow you can do it on your own. The real thing in politics is get everybody behind you. It's not easy in coalition politics.
And of course, one of the main institutional differences between our two systems is that you have a lot more time, maybe too much time, some
Much too
might
much
say,
time.
to form that agreement,
Yeah.
whereas our schedule is very compressed. 2 weeks.
Yeah. Look, I'm not going to judge that. You have a constitution, you have a presidential system. 15 days is very short because automatically you're getting into, jobs rather than policies. That's unavoidable. That we don't have. I think we are negotiating much too long that everybody thinks, what the heck are these people doing there? I mean, it leads to depoliticization, the estimation or the looking at the political class as something very distant. I think there is maybe also a way between. I mean, if you have also in this country more of a transition period, I think somebody told me the other day, like in the US, the president is elected and you have at least 2 months to do a transition.
Yeah.
There are party platforms before that. You don't obviously, I mean, every country has its own adaptations. I would not suggest you're going into 4 months of negotiations. But my feeling is that if you do it too quick, this issue of how you appoint ministers becomes awkwardly enough more important than it is. We have the system in our country, and I guess it wouldn't probably work right now in the political situations you are, but basically the prime minister, who in our country is what we call primus inter pares, so he is not like your president. He doesn't have, I like my prime minister, but he really couldn't tell me what to do in foreign affairs. Of course, you had to negotiate in the council and come to an agreement. But I would say that the issue of consensus seeking and making sure that the first biggest party gets the prime minister, the second gets to choose the second post, which is mostly finance. You want to make sure where the money goes. The third is then by the third party, in very many cases because of what we have in Europe right now on Ukraine and so on, it's now defense. But these are the things that it works in our country. So I think that's slightly different than in South Africa.
So you were talking previously in your last question about the voters ultimately, being the deciding factor. And I'm curious about this because especially when you have what is called in a European context a grand coalition, a coalition between parties that are in some sense ideological adversaries.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you do voters, I mean, is there a sense in which voters might see you as having sold out, basically, that, you campaigned on all these principles, but you clearly just want to have a minister portfolio for yourself? How do you manage that?
Well, sometimes you don't manage it well, to be very honest. Politics remains issues of elections to voters, insecurity, whatever formula, institution, convention you have. You have municipal elections. It will be interesting to see how that works out. So you have always the pressure of the real world, the voters, and that's what democracy is all about. It's never that you can plan these things. That's almost anti-democratic. But what I would suggest on what you are saying right now is that, for instance, for my party, after we had 5 years of a very good coalition, we thought among each other with pretty much ideological differences, but we agreed along the lines I just mentioned by certain procedures and a vision and a plan, etc., etc. The ministers of my party were popular. We lost the elections and we lost, I think, 60% of the vote. Because the narrative, the vision of the government, and to a certain extent the implementation, was seen as the narrative of the other party. And so yes, the idea was you've sold out. And we're still not over that. And may I make it slightly more general? If you look to European politics more general or worldwide, we live, fortunately not here, but in a time of very strong democratic recession. And that comes to your point. We have in Europe the strengthening of the extreme right. In my country, we have opened up the government to the extreme right. This is a big discussion. Sometimes people say you rather have a firewall against sort of extreme forces that are only identitarian, sometimes very racist also, against immigration and so on. Germany has that policy. We're not going to govern with them. In my country, at some point, people said it's better to let them govern in a coalition as well, because then people still see if they can do anything or not. because otherwise they become bigger and bigger and bigger. This is the risk we see in Germany right now.
I
So
do
the big
th-
coalition is basically leading every day to a strengthening of the far right.
I do think populist parties in general often tend to function better in opposition than in governance. So maybe there is a danger that if you exclude extremist movements from ever participating in a coalition, they will always be able to maintain a narrative that we could have done things so much better. And then you have to worry that one day maybe they get so big that they don't need a coalition.
This just happened, frankly, in my country. We had the populist leader, Geert Wilders, you might have heard about him, who had by far the biggest vote at that time among the voters, which was for us, obviously, many of our people also I mean, 20% is extreme right in Europe at the moment, and they can often also, because the rest is fragmenting, have the biggest party. They went into the government. And friend and foe would say they made an enormous mess out of it. Friend and foe. It was amateuristic, there was no legal, everything didn't go well. So that government even broke. They left the government after a few months when they had to take difficult decisions. Now the jury is still out, because normally you would find the reaction of the electorate by saying, okay, we don't want these guys and girls anymore because they made a mess out of politics. They're not governing. They're basically campaigning and not doing anything even for their own voters. And that happened. They lost the elections. That's why we have now a minority government, as the ambassador said, for the first time in our history. But the far right is still standing there, like identitarian politics often does. It's the elite. You kicked us out. The deep state wanted to continue. You see things like that in the US at the moment. And you have it in different forms here. So that's a very worrisome development. I think if you look to Europe today, we're talking about the soul of Europe. If you look, Trump, this is obviously a personal view, is dividing Europe. That is, Foreign Minister Rubio just went to Hungary. Last time he went to the far extreme right party in Germany as his normal diplomatic counterpart. So it's directly influencing politics. Putin does exactly the same in a different way. And then you get the big battle, are we able, with coalitions that often find these ideological extremes, they have to govern together like in Germany, are they able to respond to the voters? If not, I'm very afraid that we have Le Pen next year in France, Farage in the UK in a few years, and perhaps the AfD, I don't know, in Germany. So it's a big battle on democracy, populism, how you deal with coalitions, how you make sure that they are performing, how you sure that the voters look at it as something that is maybe difficult, because governing is complex. And if you have only parties who say, okay, we'll solve it in a few weeks and then everything will be fine. That is, with social media and fragmentation, definitely a risk if our parties, and I'm talking now about not left and right, but the large parties that are not extreme right or identitarian or what have you, are not doing a better job. Populism in itself is not something bad. If you don't deal with your people, you don't talk their language, there's nothing wrong with that. Populism becomes important or risky if they are basically saying there's one people and they have no differences, there's no pluralism, there's no coalition necessary, and we can go to authoritarian leadership. And we know best for all the people because there's one people and they don't have different views. That's in essence anti-democratic.
So it's almost time for us to move on to the next panel discussion, but I just have one more question that I want to ask, picking up on this topic of foreign affairs, because you were the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and that seems to me like an interesting position because in some sense, more than any other portfolio in cabinet, with the exception of, I guess, the chief executive itself, that feels to me like a position where you are charged with representing the whole of your society rather than one specific sector within it. And like, how does that feel within the context of a coalition system when you are representing just one particular party? How do you balance those two hats?
If you allow me to correct you on one point, each minister in our governments from day one represents the country. If it's social affairs or economic affairs or foreign affairs. Maybe in foreign affairs, it sounds a bit more logical because basically you're dealing with the national interest and the definition of that national interest. And there you can differ, like you differ in this country around many issues on Ukraine and Russia and Gaza and you name it. But, and we have the same too. I think what interests me in foreign policy these days is, or I should say maybe in terms of your question, I think it's absolutely key for coalitions to govern that ministers realize from day one, yes, of course they are there. They went into politics, hopefully, to get something going for the people they represent and for their ideals. That is still very much the case in my country, fortunately. But you represent from one day the country, nobody else. Not your own party, not your party friends or party vultures. You are there to represent the people and to make sure that, you know, in the way you have your coalition agreement, at that moment that is seen as, you know, the sort of implementation of the national interest according to these political groupings. And if you change that I think it's a very crucial element. I mean, if I see sometimes people getting into government just thinking that they can represent, and that has also something to do, I know that's different here, but you have a longer history, which I understand very much because of your liberation struggle, but I'm very much in favor of an independent civil servants. I never looked at, never, ever to what my civil servants, what members of what party they were. I couldn't care less. Yes, if they wouldn't execute what you have agreed, then you have a problem. And I know that's slightly different here, but for understandable historical reasons. But in a sense, this idea of getting more to independent civil servants, and I don't mean that they have to be neutral, or don't have to have their own views, or that they have their own public opinions. Of course, they're free citizens. But in the end, it's important that if a coalition works for its citizens, and that's debatable right now, do people feel distrust in politics is far away, or do they feel on unemployment, on security, they're really doing something? And my fear in Europe at the moment, to be very honest with you, it is an honest conversation, we have not been able, unfortunately, to get this idea that politics is there for everybody and it's not just a political class. And this disgruntlement on politics led immediately in my country to the fragmentation. We had two big parties that grew in one election, they now already have 0 votes. Why? Because people saw, hey, this is the platform where really, and it was not an extreme right party, it was a party who thought actually this big coalition you're talking about didn't succeed in really doing something for citizens. So basically what happened immediately afterwards, people started new parties, you have that here too, I know in different areas and regions. And they said, okay, we are going to do it better. And then they came into a coalition and the next time they were out as well. So the defense of democracy and the defense of a reforming state, if it's reforming, is absolutely crucial. Otherwise, people will think the dynamics are everywhere, and to a certain extent they are everywhere.
So thank you. On that slightly somber note, I'm going to hand back to Dr.
Sorry, that wasn't the idea. I think it is alive. Democracy is alive. I mean, I see, the last point, I wouldn't take the time, but a new generation is working in this country and in our country. We're here at the university with my students. They are really reorganizing politics, so I'm very proud of that.
So thank you. Please stay seated. For the online attendees, I'd just like to say that you're welcome to participate, and we're going to move now into the next part of our program, which is a panel discussion. You're invited to post any questions or comments that you might have on the Q&A function, and we'll have someone who will actually relay them to the facilitator at the point where where we open up for discussion. But we have an hour now for the next panel, and Prof. Koenders, whom I've already introduced, will form part of that panel, but we have, as per your program, a few other speakers who will come and share their experiences and remarks, and I'd like to invite them up. First is Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool, welcome. Then we have Professor Susan Boyson. Welcome, Professor. And Professor Richard Calland. I think they are well known to all of us, but I would like to just introduce them very, very briefly. Ambassador Rasool is a political figure and former diplomat. He served as a former ambassador to the South African, a South African ambassador to the United States from 2010 to 2015, and again in the 2024-25 period. He's also been a member of the National Assembly, and he served as the 5th Premier of the Western Cape from 2004 to 2008. Professor Boyson is a political scientist, author, and analyst of South African politics. She's also an emeritus professor at the University of the Witwatersrand and a visiting professor at the Wits School of Governance. Has done extensive research on coalition governance. She's edited the Mistra volume titled Marriages of Inconvenience, the Politics of Coalitions, and actually has been the driving force behind the major Mistra project called the Coalitions Barometer. Professor Richard Calland has extensive experience of research and public engagement in constitutional law, politics and sustainability. As a member of the London Bar, he practiced law for several years before coming to South Africa in 1994. He's also an emeritus professor in public law at the University of Cape Town, and he's a visiting adjunct professor at the Wits School of Governance, also with extensive experience on and writings on coalition governance. I'm going to hand back to the facilitator for the rest of the discussion in this part of the program. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll start with you, Ambassador Rasool, and why don't you give us your thoughts on the topic and perhaps your response to some of the issues that were raised.
No, thank you very much. I think the important part of my CV is that I've been ANC chairperson in the Western Cape and Premier in the Western Cape, and all of that was with an experience of coalition. None of that was where the ANC governed alone or won an election with 51%. And that's particularly what I'd like to bring to a discussion like this. It may seem fairly prehistoric given a culture of elections and a regularity of coalitions that are building up. But I think in the calm space of the 90s into the 2000s, I think that there is lessons that I think we have had to think through very hard for constructing a Western Cape government. And I've reflected on this particularly when the national government had to be formed in 2024, and coalitions and people in the presidency said, can you just pen down some of those experiences from the Western Cape that we could be learning from? And so I'm just going to, by and large, regurgitate in a very short period of time just what it was. So that's my credential. So I've said that, and we've developed metaphors to describe the situation we're in, because that gives you a way to reflect upon yourself and your own strength. Because sometimes you can be emboldened by your history, but not understand what your percentage is. And so we've never been in a situation where the ANC in the Western Cape was an outpatient, generally healthy, but going for checkups regularly. We've never had that situation. But, for example, in 1994, we were reduced to about 33% of the vote, and we saw ourselves in high care. How did we get to 33%? And therefore, we've got to take the medicine. And the medicine was an enforced coalition of a government of provincial unity that reflected the national. And I had the situation where the last apartheid police minister was my premier, and I had to get on with him, despite personal animus and all of those kind of things. And we understood the objectives of it. It was to stabilize government, prevent counter-revolution, and to be able to get a modicum of services to our people. So we bought into it, and we performed fairly well. I believe to the extent that by 98 they wanted us out of the coalition, but offered us to ensure that the African vote stayed in the coalition. They offered us 2 token posts. The hardest post, housing and police. And we said, no, thank you. So we walked away from it so that we don't tokenize ourselves and take responsibility for things which are intractable. By 2001, we entered as a majority into a coalition with the walkaways from the National Party. But we gave them the premiership because our goal was the 2004 election. We didn't want to take an early victory. So we formed a coalition in which we gave Peter Marais and then Martinus van Schalkwyk the premiership. And so it was a very pragmatic way in which we viewed it. And then by 2004, we went into the election as a coalition force and won collectively 53% of the vote. And then we took the lion's share of the cabinet. I became premier, and we were able to drive programs that we wanted to, because we had prearranged certain priorities and visions that we would want to have. And we had, by and large, created a shared, if I can call it values, but a shared constituency between black and brown, if I can call it like that, the agtergebleves, the marginalized who needed to come into the right. So I wanted to say that that really were our thing, because and after that, the ANC went into ICU. It fell under 30%. And the prospect of, it was a battle for survival, not a battle for governance in the Western Cape. And so those were the kind of ways in which we used the metaphor. What helped us to clarify things is to consider a relationship, a partnership, or working together, as the president called it in SONA. How do we work together? Use that as the fundamental base. Then discover what the nature of working together is. And so we said that if we are forced, for example, into a shared emergency where we needed to work together because there was an emergency outside, then it would be a tactical front that we formed. If we shared objectives with any party, we'd have a strategic coalition. But if we shared values with people, we'd enter into an alliance. So you don't give it a name too early. You just have a relationship, and you decide whether you're engaged, one-night stand, or marry. And that is a very descriptive way for us to work through it. And I'm saying all of this inelegantly because they've only given me 6 minutes. So as a way to develop metaphors that you can also publicly communicate to your base. You say, no, with this new National Party, we are in a one-night stand. The enforced coalition with Ernest Kriel is a shotgun marriage that was negotiated. But now we are entering a fairly pragmatic engagement. We are governing out of that. So it's an absolutely crucial way for us to think through it. I also think that it allows you not to think, because a lot of coalitions stumble because they think, who is the party that you are in relationship with? But we thought about it differently. We thought, for example, because for us at that point, like the ANC found itself in 2024, not as the African National Congress, the liberation movement, it was the incumbent. And incumbency breeds complacency. Complacency creates elites. Elites decay. They become corrupt, they lack service delivery, they become tone deaf and socially distant. So if you think of yourself then as an incumbent, or if you think of your potential partners as incumbents, you know what their weak points are. If you think of yourself as an incumbent, you know what your areas of improvement would be. We also thought at that point, when we excluded the Democratic Alliance, because they had become the party, what we referred to then as the Ancien regime, the forces of the status quo. They wanted to revert to aspects of white privilege and and so forth. And what we said is that's going to be the platform on which we're going to campaign. What's different in Constantia and Khayelitsha? How many police in Constantia? How many police in Khayelitsha? What's the crime profiles and so forth? And with and we were then, in a sense, the insurgents. We were coming into that election as the outsiders, the ones who were left out. We gathered the National Party people who were left out with us, and we then did the insurgency on it. And by and large, we could form with them a thing that, one, crime was going to be important. So our challenges were two sides of the same coin. The firm, which was the coalition of gangsters, who controlled drugs and crime and prostitution and all of those kind of things, and their counterpart, Pagat, People Against Gangsterism and Drug, which became an urban terror platform. And we said that that's the emergency that must ensure that we get together, and this is the platform on which we will deal with them. We will activate the POCA legislation, we will activate anti-terror and RICA laws and all of those kind of things against it, and so forth. So I thought that I wanted to describe our experiences in that kind of way, because rather than being prehistoric, I think it gives us tools to try and understand what it is, to look with a different lens at who your partners could be, and to think differently about what the states of relationship are, as opposed to just using a intellectually lazy formulation that everything is coalition. Because, and I end on this, because the point is, if you don't self-understand those kind of things, you can't communicate to your base. You can't communicate the difference between a one-night stand, an engagement, or a marriage to your base. Everything looks like a Catholic marriage to them. You can't say what is tactical, what is strategic, and what is principle, and that we are not in a principled relationship with anyone. And so I just want to leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you for that. It's interesting to hear about your practical experiences and how you think about those distinctions. Let me hand over now to Professor Booysen. You, of course, have been studying from a political science perspective coalitions for a long time, and have seen, I think, them grow from a small localized phenomenon into a national one. How do you feel about where we are now, and what are your thoughts on the current situation?
Thank you, Lawrence. And yes, I thought I will take my few minutes here and try to give a summary of how coalitions have been evolving, especially in the last 2-3 years, and particularly since 2024, local elections coming long before that. And yes, much learning has been taking place from previous historical situation, also from 1994, that brief period of government of national unity there. But we have come a long way in South Africa, and the political parties have certainly learned how to use coalitions for survival and maybe occasionally for governance. And it really often takes a huge sense of humor to appreciate what is happening in South African politics, because whatever way coalitions can be used, whether they're called alliances or whatever other personal form, they are wild, wicked, and wonderful. And South Africans should really have their seatbelts on and enjoy the ride and help guide. Oh, and maybe that's too patronizing, or at least understand party politics and see where it's going, and get understanding of what the rules are that drives these political parties in their pursuits of power, mostly of power, and survival power in many cases. And this, of course, is while lawmakers in South Africa are also on a pursuit of creating order, creating stability. Those have become some of the slogans of our time. It's assumed that stability is necessary. Sometimes stability can be superfluous or counterproductive. When things really need to change, one needs instability, please, to get those changing. But so we have this interesting contradiction while lawmakers often pursue get more legislation in place. We see that at local government is proposed legislation, but political parties are just doing their own thing. They are doing whatever is at hand, whatever way they can manufacture majorities. Coalitions at this stage in South African politics is very much about majority manufacturing. Doesn't matter if the person or the other party is ideologically opposed or not. Does not matter whether there are principles involved or shared visions involved. As long as they are prepared to cooperate and help build that majority, that will be. So in this wild world of coalition politics, the lawmakers are perhaps pursuing, and in much public narrative too, pursuing the possibility of getting stability, order, etc. But on the ground, things are moving, and I think we know, and I'll refer very briefly to it just now, small political parties have a big role in instability in South Africa. And we even think of thresholds, perhaps a 2% one, low threshold probably, but I actually, looking at political dynamics, just do not see how that is going to work. I think political parties are going to object to that. There is already so much acceptance of the role of small and micro parties, often minuscule, 1, 2 representatives in big institutions and big councils. But I think they are taking on a role of their own. And the bigger parties frequently depend on these small and micro parties to manufacture their minorities. It's difficult to manage those coalitions, but I think the very small parties have carved out a role for themselves in South African coalition politics, and the bigger parties, I think, are going to endorse a continuous role for very small parties, even if it brings instability, if it's a bad thing, even if it brings instability, because the big parties, often are in precarious power situations where they really have to build those coalitions one by one representative by one representative. South African coalition politics is also complicated. It's not unusual in the world, but by the fact that there are different coalitions forming, different types and with different parties at national, provincial and local levels. National and sub-level coalitions often differ in their party political configurations across the world. That in South Africa, of course, we all know the details. Sometimes it's a grand coalition, sometimes it's a minority coalition, but with the element of confidence and supply coming into it, or any variation of the above. And sometimes they mimic the national coalition, sometimes they don't. An interesting thing that I think is not entirely unique but in South Africa, but it's surfacing more and more, is the interactivity between coalitions at different levels. For example, think about Ekurhuleni's mayoral management committee that has just been reshuffled because the EFF had threatened that if they do not get more positions on this municipal executive committee in this metro in Gauteng, if they don't get more seats there, then they will withdraw from the Gauteng, not from the Gauteng governing coalition, they are not in a government in Gauteng, but from the position of confidence and supply where they have been supporting the ANC in several votes, and that is the understanding. So very often, and that's a fascinating part of South African coalitions, I believe, as well. Doesn't matter if you're not in the governing coalition. Even if you're not, you often have a lot of power. Think of the situation of the EFF. Nationally, we see EFF also exercising a lot of power. Even if they're not in coalition, they often bring the ANC to book with they mobilize in certain ways. The ANC sits up and listens. And yes, that is the nature of South African coalition politics. But yes, I said I'm going to try to, I'll have to do it very quickly, and give an overview of the rules as they have been shaping and forming in South African politics. Okay, against this background of different coalitions at different levels of government, I take a primary set of rules. There is no permanent majority, are no permanent majorities, and there are no permanent partners. So things vary. Any political party at any time can become, literally, become the new partner. We've seen that, for example, in local government coalitions in the eastern part of the Western Cape, where suddenly the DA Freedom Front coalition was broken up and the Freedom Front person became the coalition partner to the ANC, and imagine, and got the mayorship in that municipality. And I've heard through interviews, it's really been facilitated in a way by the fact that the ANC is in a confidence and supply type of relationship provincially in the Northern Cape, with the Freedom Front as an important party backing them. Okay, that's the primary set of rules. The secondary set of rules that I distinguish in South African coalition politics is really that partners can contest one another. If you're in a coalition through public narratives and debates, think DA, ANC nationally, for example, many municipalities, but you can, for example, take one another to court. That's quite fine to do that. And that's accepted as one of the ways our coalition politics work. Of course, there's minimal and delayed institutionalization. Professor De Visser reminded me just now that something that he heard in workshops the last few days as really the non-usage of the clearinghouse mechanism, which is the type of conflict resolution mechanism at the national level. Thank you for placing that on the table too. That supports my point. Minimal institutionalization. Do not give much credence to conflicts that arise. Try to wish the conflicts away. Maybe a bit of personal engagement or interaction here or there will help them go away. But don't glorify through institutionalization. Coalition agreements, preferably do not have formalization of coalition agreements. That's one of the big questions, to get more formal coalition agreements. And we know that will bring that good thing of more stability, more predictability, maybe free politicians from the pursuit of power and get them to the position that they can spend more time on governance and delivery. But we know, even in municipalities and provinces where there are not coalition governments, the problems are immense. So coalitions isn't the only reason for instability, for poor governance, etc. And yes, another rule is also do not commit too much pre-election. Don't tell voters too much who are you going to cooperate with. But if you do, don't worry about it, voters. We can change after the election. Depends how many votes we need from which party to get the majority government going there. So yes, and of course there's a tertiary set of rules as well. Coalitions and partnership coalitions have become a big part of the internal contests within political parties. Think ANC, think DA, a few of the smaller parties as well, where succession, even it's a wonderful, fabulous issue to use, coalition membership or not, GNU membership or not, and across the levels, whether you are going to win an internal election or not. Of course, I have to just mention micro and small parties and independents again. They define so much of South African coalition politics in this current conjuncture. They often contribute at 1 or 2 single seats as necessary to manufacture a majority. They threaten, fascinating, motions of no confidence against their own coalition partners. I'm closing now. They threaten those against their own coalition partners because it is convenient. And in Johannesburg, for example, there's something like the Minority Governing Parties Forum and a few other variations as well. And this forum will line up against the ANC as the main partner in a coalition like that. And they negotiate for better positions, etc. And my final point here, just ideology. Our coalitions don't worry about ideology so much. There is a lot of cross-positioning. It's terrific for the ANC to be in coalition with the Democratic Alliance. They can subdue them a little bit. They can become friendly with them and get less opposition from the second biggest political party in Parliament, for example. And it will be fine to have them in a coalition, but also really attack them, really say nasty things about them, and not saying it's not often justified. And many parties do that with their coalition partners. But it's just fine to be in a coalition and attack them and make them out as the enemy. These are my syntheses of the main rules. So we need a sense of humor, we need to fasten the seatbelts. This is coalition politics in South Africa. And the main quest, I believe, here is how to get government going, keep governance going in that time of wild and wonderful party politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Boyson. So, Professor Cowland, well, we've heard a sort of practitioner perspective from Ambassador Rasool. We've heard Professor Boyson's explication of some of the informal rules of coalition politics. How do you see the situation?
Yeah, thank you, Lawrence. How long would you like me to speak for?
Just give us 10.
Because I'd like to be obedient on that. What would be ideal for you?
Go for like 10 minutes.
10 minutes? That's an awful lot. Well, shall we suggest, can we go for 6?
Sure. Yeah. That's very generous of you.
All right.
I'm trying to create equality amongst the different.
No, I can't match them. It would be so 6. Let's aim for 6. And let me be obedient on that, but disobedient in terms of your question, because I came prepared to make a few remarks from a comparative perspective. I could, of course, talk about what I think is going on now, and maybe my observations from a comparative perspective will have some applicability. They ought to, otherwise, what's the point? And I do think there is a great deal to be learnt from other places, and we should look to other places. And I'm glad, therefore, that this conversation is happening with participation from people from the Netherlands who've had experience and can speak with authenticity about what's happened. In 2016, and it didn't require a great deal of intelligence on my part, but it was obvious then, despite what had happened in the 2000s in this province, it was, for me, the key moment was 2016 in terms of the start of a new era of politics, when the ANC lost its majority in significant cities in this country. And at that time, sometimes one's professional and personal lives collide or collude. And it so happened that my now wife, who is half German, meant that I spent more time than I'd perhaps expected to in Germany. And I observed at relatively close quarters what was going on in German politics. And there was an election around that time there, which took, I think, close to 9 months for the German coalition agreement to form. And I watched that with a certain amount of awe, as the government continued, notwithstanding the uncertainty in the political realm. That led me then to create, off my own bat, in effect, a comparative project, which led to, with the support of the Germans and then the Danes, 2 study trips that I convened. And I'm just saying this to kind of explain the vantage point from which I come. The first was to Germany in December 2019, and the second was to Denmark in September 2022. And the second one focused more on local government. Now, the lessons from those two trips would take me 6 hours to set out, so I'm not going to do that. We learnt a great deal, and the delegations from South Africa, comprising a significant number of really significant political leaders from parties here. And the second trip, we had, I think, 90% of the parties represented in that delegation of 9 political leaders. So it was very, I think, significant opportunity. I keep bumping into people like Minister Clavisa, who tell me the things I learned in Denmark are so valuable to me now as I negotiate and then execute coalition government. So that's all to simply say, to reinforce the point that comparative perspectives are important. So here are 4 points that I would quickly like to throw into the room. The first actually draws from another country, the United Kingdom, my original country. I continue to follow politics there. And in 2010, we had the first coalition government for a very long time, as you know. What happened then to the Liberal Party was an absolute disaster for them. Why? Because they failed to redline the most important issues for them. They were outwitted and outmaneuvered by the Conservative Party, and they went from 57 seats to 7 seats the next election, and they were wiped out. The lesson from that, which I know the DA has taken on to heart, is that you have to be very clear-minded in your negotiations, and you have to be very clear and hard-nosed in negotiating and protecting the things that matter most to you and to your voters, most importantly. And I think that Helen Zille has, as a result of that, and she came to Germany in December 2019, she has set herself a really good and tough exam question, which is this: can she lead and be part of a smaller party in government with a bigger party that benefits electorally from that process? Because the history of such arrangements tend to lead to the smaller party of the two suffering electorally. And one of the things we learnt in Germany, and it was put very bluntly to us by some leading politicians from the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, who had been in a grand coalition for about 10 years at that point. And as you well know, Lawrence, the Germans described their coalitions by reference to numbers, traffic light, etc. And the red-black coalition had been around for a very long time. And the point that was made to us was that people no longer saw red and black, they saw brown sludge. And the brown sludge was because the two parties had lost their identity. They'd been unable to continue to communicate to the electorate their own separate values, their own separate political identity, and so on. That's a very important lesson, and it's one that the DA has taken on. It's one that the ANC also, I think, has to take care of as the two, and I agree with people who say this is really a grand coalition with adornments rather than a so-called government of national unity. That's the first point. The second then takes us to the point of what should you write down. I agree with those who argue that you shouldn't over-institutionalize this. I take it, Professor Boyson, that your rules were, in the spirit of a good humor, said with a great deal of irony. But the idea that you shouldn't over-institutionalize is, I think, right. To prelude my final point, it will be that it's about culture and leadership rather than rules of the game. But perhaps as a lawyer, I can say that there is soft law that should be applied to this, either through conventions or culture, the way that Professor Kunders has referred to, or by writing down your agreement. And I'll never forget when we, as a appetizer for the study trip to Germany, the 6 Stiftungs arranged for senior leaders to come here for a workshop which took place in May 2018 in Parliament with all of the chief whips. At that meeting, one of the representatives from a German political party brought with him the agreement that his party and others had entered into in a particular province in Germany, and it was this big. And he slapped it on the table, and the table nearly broke. Now, is that a good idea? Do you need to go to that level of detail? Probably not. That would be quite exceptional. Do you have to have more than the statement of intent, the so-called statement of intent, that is the only written down document for the partnership between, let's call it that, the DA and the ANC, and then the others that cared to sign it? I think you need a lot more than that. And and I think the clue is in the name, statement of intent, does not tell us that this is a all-encompassing agreement. That was envisaged as a second step. And depending on who you speak to, that second step hasn't happened for different and competing reasons. But clearly more needs to be written down, especially with regards to conflict resolution and dispute resolution. If you do not say how you're going to resolve your disputes and put in place an institutional mechanism to do so, you're going to have trouble, and it's going to become precarious. That's the second point. A third point then would be that the communication within parties, and this goes to the legitimacy point that was raised earlier. How do you maintain legitimacy? And clearly, in an ideal world, you want the public as a whole to understand why X, Y, and maybe Z have got into bed together, to use Ambassador Rasool's broad metaphor. You have to explain that clearly and communicate it to as many people as possible, but especially, and perhaps more than anything, to your internal stakeholders. And I'll never forget meeting with Michael Kellner, the Secretary General of the Green Party in Germany, who on his wall in his office had a map of Germany with all of the different coalition arrangements that his party was in. 18 different coalition arrangements around the country, each of them with a different concoction or formula. And he said, my biggest job and my biggest headache is how do I communicate to the membership of the Greens in Germany why it is in one part of the country we are in bed with the Social Democrats, in another part with the Christian Democrats, and so on and so forth. And so that internal communication job is something I don't think the political parties in this country have yet fully grasped, and that's going to be essential going forward. A last and final point, a fourth one. It's clear that developing the conventions and the maturity and the culture and the leadership that is necessary for power sharing takes time. And so we will need to be patient in this country, and patience isn't perhaps our greatest virtue. Bear in mind the Germans have been at this for many decades, and they still struggle with it. And we've heard about the Dutch experience, and the message I take from you, Professor Gerndes, is that even when you get it right, it's still not perfect. It's difficult. It's really difficult, and one has to just accept a level of imperfection. The Danes, who we visited, have not had a majority government for 100 years. So they've had a lot of experience at how to manage this and to build the social capital necessary to overcome the challenges. So we need to balance patience with a necessary impatience to kind of get it as right as possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all four of you for the insights that we've had over the past hour. I'd really like to now open this up to the floor and start getting some discussion and input from our audience here today, as well as from our online audience. So our organizers will be walking around with microphones. So could I ask you, raise your hands if you'd like to ask a question. I think I'll take about 3 questions at a time. And may I perhaps ask, for the interest of time, try to focus on questions rather than comments, and also let us know which specific panel member you'd like to address them to. Thanks. Okay, well, no one's raising their hands just yet. So while you maybe think about, okay, oh, fantastic. Well, while you think about any questions that there are, I'd like to read some questions that have been coming up from our online audience. So one of them, I believe this is presumably directed to you, Professor Koenders. Cecil asks, how does the Netherlands deal with international relations in a coalition arrandment? And then, there's 2 others that I'll just say, whoever on the panel wants to take them can. And Dile asks, what is the most appropriate definition of our current government? Is it a coalition or a government of national unity? How should we refer to it? Job asks whether our electoral system is an impediment to accountability and whether a constituency-based electoral system would not enhance greater coherence. So I'll ask anyone who has an opinion. Let's start with Cecil's question to you.
Thank you very much for the question, Cecil. And thank you for also the debate, and we can come back because I loved the statement on sort of what we can learn from you in heterodox coalition forming. But we'll come to that later. Look, international affairs, basically what happens is that depending on the international situation, there is more or less of an agreement being formulated. Everybody realizes foreign policy, international policy, is something very fluid, it's very unpredictable. Many things are happening. We have a relatively small country. You have to look with who you work. So, I mean, there's a lot of flexibility, first of all, for the government. And the second thing is that, there is also a history of a certain amount of consensus making around foreign policy. Nevertheless, at the moment that the world gets more in disorder, we see that most of our voters are actually voting on international issues without probably mentioning it as this. Migration comes from outside. Winners and losers from globalization and the internal market, and what happens to labor markets and artificial intelligence. And Europe. We have a lot of Eurosceptic people that you saw also in Britain, obviously. And you have people who think about it differently. And those sort of main principles about what you want to accomplish is in a coalition agreement. And the most strong example now is the defense issue, because NATO has agreed on 5%, 3.5 plus 1.5% GDP on defense. That's enormous. And besides how you think about that, if it's correct or not, that makes it immediately important that the government agreement, and with a lot of flexibility. Yeah? We're not that structured as I might have said before, but you need to organize that. Where does the money come from? And the big debate is: does it come from social issues? Then a lot of the electorate would say, okay, we make ourselves resilient because of the existential threat with Russia and Ukraine, but our people are going to be less resilient. They're going to be paying the price. So then the question is, who pays for it and how do you do it? So in short, it's much more flexible, much more general, but nevertheless, on key issues right now, there are certain directions that are necessary for the type of coalitions of willing that we are engaged in.
Who would like to answer the question about defining the government that we have right now?
Sure. One sentence, easy one. Of course it is a coalition. To call it a government of national unity is a political choice to give it a name. Of course it isn't a government of national unity. Parties number 3 and 4 are not in that. So it cannot be, it's a political choice. And of course it was basically one between the ANC and the DA, and 8 other small parties were brought in to give it an aura of general inclusivity, and 10 out of 18 parties in parliament are in it. And yes, pretty wide representation, but it's simply a coalition.
Well, can I just argue with that for a moment, just for the sake of it? I mean, yes, but what sort of coalition was the question, I think. And I think there's 2 answers to that. One, you partly mentioned, Susan, which is it's a grand coalition at heart, with that adornment for political reasons, I think, to make it easier to sell to within the ANC. That's the short point. I'm not sure it would have got over the line internally with the ANC had there not been the additions. And of course, connected to that, the overlapping point is that the additions mean that there's a superfluity. It's a surplus coalition. It doesn't require, anyone can leave, apart from the ANC obviously, and there would still be a majority, there'd still be a government. And that again was connected to the first point, that made it easy to sell internally, because Ramaphosa can say to his colleagues, we're not dependent on the DA, and technically they're not. But the truth is, the grand coalition is that when the DA 3 times last year nearly left or was pushed out. That caused huge tremors, and the broader society, especially in business and the investment world, was greatly alarmed by that.
Okay, let's take questions from well, let's take some questions from within the room.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thanks. This is to all, and I want to go back to the question on international relations, and I suppose my question is a bit more pointed than the one that came from online, and it's about how, coalitions, and I suppose from the experience of Professor Kunduz on the one hand, to the experience of Mr. Rasool as well, and to the other panels about their thoughts about it, how coalitions manage very thorny foreign policy issues, and I think that here my question does come from a serious place here, in which you may have, for instance, a very kind of you can call it controversial issue, such as the Gaza situation, in which you have, one party that's in the coalition that has a very clearly defined policy and understanding of the situation. Sure, they might, have different approaches, but there's a very clear understanding of it. And then you have another partner that sees it in a very, very different way and wants to engage with it in a very, very different way. And how does that, I suppose, maybe from Mr. Rasool's point of view, what are the challenges involved in that? And maybe from Professor Kunduz' point of view, has there been a similar experience from a Dutch point of view in this? And the second example is with the relationship with the United States, which I think brought about a very interesting way that the coalition government responded here, in which you have one party that would send delegations to, do what delegations do, I suppose, when they go to the US, and send a very different set of messages from what, we understand what the line should be in terms of what, the Department of Foreign Affairs, or pardon me, DIRCO should be, etc., which are contradictory. And I'm just curious from sort of both of you, like both from the experience point of view and both from the expectation practitioner kind of point of view, how are those managed? Because I think that on the first instance, yes, there is the kind of expectation that, one must strive for pragmatism. But I think that on certain issues, it's not very easy to be pragmatic. You need to choose a side. Thank you.
Thanks. Are there any other questions from the audience? I see a few. I think I see 2 from that side and 1 from that side. Let's take all 4 questions basically, and then I'll hand it back to the panel.
Shall I go ahead? Yeah. Thanks, Jaap de Visser from the University of the Western Cape. I wanted to hone in on the issue of the role of the civil service. A key difference between the Netherlands and South Africa is this role of the professionalized, independent, non-partisan civil service, and that's an issue that we struggle with in South Africa. Now, and we see that sort of on two ends of the spectrum. One side there is the politicization of the administration, which particularly at local government level is rife and crude and devastating, where a change in political flavor in the council somehow needs to result immediately in suspensions and dismissals of senior management, which with disastrous consequences. But also on the other side of the spectrum, with and this is what I wanted, maybe Professor Kunduz could respond to this from the Dutch experience, is that also those civil servants that are in their positions and thoughtful about the position that they hold, their position is, I want to stay away from coalition politics as far as possible. Don't ask me anything, don't involve me, I will not provide any information, I will speak to you when there's white smoke coming out of the chimney and there's a coalition. Until then, I have no role to play, which is different in the Netherlands because the independent civil service feeds the political parties with information. So I wonder if anyone on the panel, and particularly Professor Koenders, could comment on that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And then there were two more hands up before, so let's take both of them.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, facilitator. I think I have a much deeper question, and I think I like the metaphors, but I want to turn this a bit, with its head down. A post-colonial country definitely has major difficulties, and I'm sure data does show that you have many people who are set and on a very large scale with major indices of disadvantage. And then therefore the case of ideology, Prof. Well, she happens to be my supervisor. She happened to be my supervisor a couple of years ago. The case of ideology becomes a very difficult one to lose because you are dealing with a real challenge of disparities that you need to be closing the gap between your populace in general. So therefore, for me, that is a major question. This is not about a boardroom dance. It's not about boardroom dance, it's about people out there. So that's the first one as a question. Where do we leave citizens and followers and in this space, particularly dealing with their own condition? Remember, every other development and every other government is about changing the condition of the human being and their spaces. So if coalitions are not getting into that detail and they refuse going into agreements and charters that are about that change, then they are not for the citizens. They are about boardroom dance, to give another analogy or metaphor for it. That's the first one. So the issue for me is, if anything, the spaces that these coalitions are entered, they should be about the data of what the country looks like and how then we are seeking to change that condition. The second one for me is probably this is where we need to be learning in the experienced democracies. Your coalitions in those democracies, what is exactly, well, I follow the German part a bit because I've been there and understand it, but the bit about in the other countries with respect, what is the focus? What are you driving in these different, political parties? Just beyond the left and the right, what is the key? Because, of course, you will say the left is disintegrating and the left is no longer cohering, the right is gaining momentum and ground, but on what basis are they gaining the momentum and ground? And again, I bring the question, what is the data showing in those individual countries? Or is it that in these developed democracies, it is accepted that all our ambitions are going to be about, seeking to be up at the top of the ladder? So the elitism is what we're seeking to be. So there is no longer concern about the low rank of, the class in those societies. And then therefore, again, what is the essence of coalitions in that instance? Are they solving a problem or is it equally the boardroom dance? The boardroom dance, sorry.
I think okay. All right. So I think that fourth question was withdrawn. So let me now hand it back to the panel. I think, unfortunately, we're quite close to running out of time for this session. So I'm going to make it a lightning round. Answer question. Maybe pick one or two questions that you feel speaks to your area of expertise and give us your thoughts. I'm going to throw in one more, though, from the online audience. because I like it, and it's addressed specifically to you, Professor Koenders. I think it's an interesting question. Is if you had the choice today between choosing between single-party government or coalition government in the Netherlands, what do you think would do a better job of running the country? So that's probably, maybe an interesting one to ponder. But let's hand over to you, Ambassador Rasool.
No, thanks very much. I think the question on international relations and how to manage foreign policy is a critical one, because it goes back to the nature of the relationship that you have structured, and the question about whether you're in a GNU with key exclusions or whether you are in a grand coalition with key inclusions. And the difference is that you almost have, particularly in foreign policy, an incoherent base. Whoever has those portfolios run it as they see fit. And so foreign policy has been that kind of playground, if I can put it like that, and the issue of different parties sending their delegations became particularly a bugbear in the USA. Because in those first 3 months of the Trump administration, you had this outside government, your AfriForum, you had Freedom Front, you had the Democratic Alliance pitching up there and getting an audience, purely by virtue of the color of their delegations, and who was sympathetic to that. They had varying degrees of venom. The most venomous were your AfriForum about the white genocide and supplying the white papers and the videos and all of those kind of things with which the president was being. And I thought we had a better chance, for example, with the Democratic Alliance, when we heard that they were sending a delegation. I met their lobbyists, because they have a paid lobbyist in Washington. And I said, when they come, can we have a clearinghouse meeting? And they said, yeah, no, that would be nice, because I thought we were going to deal with the common issues of AGOA, the trade, why no, how do we push back on the issues of genocide and land confiscation, and how do we create a fairly common front on the geopolitical things like Russia, Ukraine, and so forth. But at the end of it, they didn't. The lobbyist did not. I bumped into the DA delegation in the Senate cafeteria, because we were both doing the offices of the Congress and the Senate. And so, and very interesting, I can't verify it, but one of the senators said, no, we've met your DA delegation, and they've said, don't end AGOA, because while it will hurt black workers, but it will hurt more white mine owners, white farmers, white factory owners. Those are going to be the victims of not having AGOA go through. And that's why I feel fairly confident as I sit here that if AGOA goes through, it's been through Congress, it's been through Senate, it could go through Trump, because he understands the color configuration now. And what was offered instead was, why don't you rather sanction the leaders of the ANC if you are angry with them? And so that became a narrative that was then put forward. So what I'm saying is, you're not just dealing with discordant foreign policy, you are dealing with, to put it mildly, competitive foreign policy. You are even dealing with cutthroat foreign policy in that regard. I thought I was the middle point. On Russia-Ukraine, for example, I said, no. We are going to meet, our president will meet Zelensky. But we are going to negotiate, and can we speak to your president, because we need to negotiate whether we push Zelensky and Putin on settling the war on the basis of the status quo ante, how it was in 2014, or the status quo as is, how it is now. Because we, in a sense, caught Trump out with that statement because he was willing to settle on the status quo as is. What Russia has gained in the conflict, they keep. Now, those are the kind of nuances that I think has been lost in the general relationship, and I'm not even sure that Europe is pushing that kind of point very strongly. In much the same way, we said then apply the principle, how do we resolve the Gaza conflict? Status quo ante or status quo as is? And the consistency of the Trump administration on the status quo as is that what Israel has largely cleared can be used for Riviera development. So that's the issues of where foreign policy is conflictual, where it is discordant, and where every portfolio is run according to the ideological, political, and policy base of a particular party. And I'm not sure that that works, but I don't think the ANC will claw its way up from 40% in order to try and regain control come the next few elections. And then just one last thing is on the issue of the disadvantages that needs to be the foundation of coalition negotiations. So I agree with Richard that a statement of intent is absolutely important. I also agree, don't come with that tomb of an agreement. But I do think that there must be a minimum of 10 or 12 bottom lines. And I go to our experience. We said the bottom line is, we used a very crude formula, 50-30-20. That's the demographics of the Western Cape. That's how employment will happen. That's how tenders will be issued. That's value of services, etc. And we by and large stuck to 50-30-20, and we wrote it in. And that's how we, because that was in the interest base of that also, we agreed this is going to be the attack on impunity by whether Pagat or whether the gangs. We agreed that this was going to be that, for cumbersome as it may be, a hospital in Mitchell's Plain and a hospital in Khayelitsha, just to be able to resolve the national question. So that's the way in which we underpinned ideology with practical policy. And I think that that seems to be a missing thing, and that's why you've got portfolio-run aspects of government rather than a whole-of-government approach to a particular matter.
Thank you very much. Well, I couldn't agree more with what you were just saying about, you know, the role of the US and Gaza. I don't have that much to add. Maybe just to say on what is different in our country. Gaza, obviously, there's not much. I think you said it quite rightly. So, I mean, there's a genocide there. Our government at the time, and still, well, we have a new government. We'll see what the new policies are. But the idea was, for most parliamentarians here, I mentioned the difference, that you needed at least a combination of pressure and diplomacy. Well, the government, it was, you know, dominated by the far right, only wanted some diplomacy. But the most important is, obviously, in our country, this divided the population. There was the whole history of the Holocaust, a Jewish community that felt threatened, and they were threatened to a certain extent. I mean, there was a lot of issues that came, had nothing to do with, you know, a strong statement on Gaza, and now you look at, you know, different Palestinians or Gazans or Jewish people. The important difference is the parliament in our country really makes a difference. And so they actually were able to change the position of this center-right government, and it led, here we go to the risk on foreign policy and coalitions, because it is so fluid, to the second fall of a government and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who didn't get from the rest of the cabinet a more critical position on Gaza and basically left. And so his party was retracted. I think actually this will happen more. The global politics will be more unpredictable. There will be so many differences of opinion within and between parties. You cannot prepare that. I mean, I'm maybe a bit more for some structure, but this is, you can't have it. But the parliament is very key in our position on this. Also regarding the Trump administration, for instance, it's a very important point. Are we going to bridge? Are we going to confront? Are we going to do something in between? a Minister of Foreign Affairs has been to go 3 or 4 times, sometimes a week, to the Parliament to figure out if he or she can take a position internationally. So that makes a lot of difference. And I would say on the issue of Gaza, the street social movements, and a large majority of parties in the Netherlands made the government change somewhat its position. On Trump, I said civil servants, it would require a lot more to say. I would say that there are 2 risks. I really strongly believe in an independent civil servants, also by giving you the facts, the policy options. But there is another side to that. I mean, a few years ago you had the discussion about the 5th power. I see sometimes in budgetary talks it's a very orthodox method of how we have to deal with the budget coming from our civil servants, and I'm not sure if that's now completely, only the facts, or is there also some issues behind it that I'm not completely trusting sometimes. But overall, I would say the importance is the independence of the civil service with certain risks, nevertheless. On the closing gap, I think this is such an important issue that I can obviously not define for South Africa. I would never want to. I know the inequality in this country, the need to make big differences in that for a young population who is highly unemployed, and in which the differences with the US, but also in AI in the future of services will be crucial, and therefore you need good politics for it. But this is much more party political position than a sort of a general academic or as a minister. I think in the end, after the Second World War, our democracy has thrived because of a social contract. It went together with a very strong welfare state. And of course here the sequencing and how you do that, it's much more complex because of years of a different history. But I think if that doesn't happen, you see that now also in the US, a small plutocratic elite. I'm not even from the far left. I'm a social democrat, so that's center left. But that's happening everywhere right now. So this is becoming more of an issue, and I'm not sure that our governments always know what to do about this. In the Netherlands, we have still, I have to say, left and right, a large consensus on reducing inequality. And most of the policies are still, some would like to go further, others less so. But here is not the biggest issue. Last point is on, would I choose single party or coalition in the Netherlands? Now this is an awful thing I would say. If it's my party, maybe. But in the end I think coalitions, we learn also from others. And I think in the end coalitions are better. But it's nice if you have a pretty strong position there.
A very quick one. I'll just to say something about ideology. I think, yes, sadly, ideology then as a distillation of the principles, ideals that people vote for, that is a victim in coalition politics situations. Whereas coalitions, of course, in own right, bring more inclusivity and thus greater democracy in that sense of the word. Coalitions are about compromise, about silences, about inaction. That we see in practice of coalition governance. And very often, the only common ground that parties find possible between them is some practical, de-ideologized solution that can please several parties at the same time. So yes, I think that's one of the sad side effects, if not primary effects, of coalitions.
I know we're out of time. I'll be very quick with 2 very short points. Firstly, it was tremendously interesting to me that Helen Zille, in a radio interview during the negotiations after the election in May 2024, signalled to anyone who cared to listen that foreign policy was not going to be a red line issue for her and the Democratic Alliance. I think for the and bear in mind, October the 7th had happened the previous year. The genocide had already started in Gaza, and that mattered to both parties in different ways. And yet she was signaling to everyone that we're not going to put a red line around that. Why? I think because for the DA, the calculation then at least was that there are no votes in this. Foreign policy, at least in this country, is not an electoral issue. That may be shifting, and clearly internationally, foreign policy is a big political and electoral issue, and that may become more of the case here. And relatedly, and this is my final point, it goes back to your conversation earlier, the 2 of you, and Professor Gunder's point about how do you narrate coalition government in a world of populism, turbulence, and disruption, I think is a huge question. And for us here, that is also a question. If there is a centre-left, centre-right coalition, which at heart is what it is, how do we persuade the Social Democrats in the ANC and the Social Liberals in the DA, if that's what they are, to continue to believe that the country is better off with them together? And how can they hold it together in a way that then protects us all, I would argue, from the ravages of a kind of criminally intentional populist alternative? That becomes our choice. And in the end, if I can mention that during that period of negotiation, my conversations with Social Democrat friends in the ANC led me to ask them to ask themselves the right question. I said, don't ask yourselves, do we like the DA? Because that will lead you to one question, one answer. Ask yourselves, who will provide the most stable partner for governance? And even, if you dare to, who will be the best partner to protect progressive politics? And when you ask the right question, you get a better answer at least. And I think we all have to, part of the maturation, I would say, is about learning to ask the right questions of each other in the process of power sharing. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to all four of you. We have slipped behind time, so I'm going to suggest that we take a 10-minute break and then return for our panel 2. But I just want to again thank you for a fantastically insightful set of perspectives from the panel, and I'd really like to end off with a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. Nice to meet you. Yeah, thanks for giving us a few extra minutes each. Thank you very much. Nice to be your moderator.
In the interest of time, we'll get started. Others will join us. But we're moving on to our second panel, the last for the day. And the title of the session is Public Engagement with Coalition Politics. We have 3 panelists and our facilitator. I'm going to introduce them very briefly. Our facilitator is Dr. Marian Kammerer, who's a senior lecturer at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance here at UCT. She's an interdisciplinary and engaged scholar working on anti-corruption, democratic governance, and accountable leadership. She convenes the Public Leadership and Governance module of the Master of Development Policy and Practice program, focusing on ethical leadership and public accountability, and she supervises master's and PhD students in this area. As our first panelist, we have Professor Jaap de Visser, who's a professor of law at the University of the Western Cape's Faculty of Law, and also the National Research Foundation Chair in Multi-Level Government, Law and Development. His research, teaching and consulting focus on multi-level government, local government, good governance and federalism in Africa, and he has published widely on these topics. Then we have Professor Zwelethwa Jolobe, who's the head of the Department of Political Studies at the University of Cape Town. He's the convener of international relations in the department and teaches international mediation, global governance, conflict in Africa, and international relations. But he's also published extensively on South African political issues such as elections, political parties, and the dynamics of political coalitions in South Africa. Mr. Lawson Naidoo is the Executive Secretary of the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, and this is one of South Africa's foremost independent civil society organizations dealing with matters of the Constitution and democratic governance. And he's a regular commentator on political, constitutional, and legal issues. I'm going to immediately or hand over to the facilitator to introduce the topic and to facilitate the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Africa, and it's great to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to facilitate a very interesting panel, really looking at the public's engagement with coalition politics. And so we have academics here, we have civil society activists, we have lawyers, people who are able to really bring it home and say, does it actually matter, or how does it matter to the majority of citizens, and what is their experience when it comes to coalition politics? What we know is that from the latest Afrobarometer that 73% of South Africans do not trust the institution of parliament. So while we're looking, that was the national parliament, I didn't look into local governance, they're experts on that. But so if citizens are not particularly engaged, or it could lead to disengagement, their levels of distrust in politics, how do we really address that? And is coalition governance going to do that? Because it seems to me that there is a direct link between levels of public trust and the democratic project, which could be at stake. And so I think it's very important to look at the citizen lens of looking at coalition governance and civil society's specific role. And so to this end, I'm going to call on each of our speakers, who are going to have 10 minutes. My role really here is as a timekeeper. I know we're running a bit late, but each of you, if you would have 10 minutes to really look at the topic which we're looking at, which is the public's engagement with the coalition politics that we're discussing this afternoon. And this first speaker is Professor Jaap de Visser from the University of the Western Cape. So over to you, Jaap.
Thanks so much, and thank you very much for the invitation and for this wonderful opportunity. So I'll use my 10 minutes as wisely as I can and make a few remarks about coalition politics in general, the role of the law, and touch on the issues of the role of the public and how voters and the public in general sort of should view the issue of coalition politics. Maybe just a quick note about the comparison between South Africa and the Netherlands, because that's how we started off, and I think it's still a very interesting context to have this discussion in. It's interesting, the electoral systems between the two countries are actually remarkably similar, both almost purely proportional representation without a special threshold. We have that in common. Of course, there are differences in our electoral systems, but we have that in common. And we're outliers in that regard. There's very few countries with a proportional representation system that do not have a special threshold. So that we have in common, us and the Dutch. I think Professor Koende spoke about the fragmentation of politics that's happening both in, I suppose, in our country and in the Netherlands. But there are, of course, so many differences, which should, I think, make any comparison. We need to see that in the context of the differences. For example, a very clear constitutional difference that the head of the government in the Netherlands is not the head of state. We have a semi-presidential system, so our president appoints cabinet and is the one that puts together the coalition, and that works entirely different in the Netherlands. I think the role of the professional independent administration, the Dutch have a very long history of non-partisan, independent, professional administrations. As I indicated earlier, we still struggle with that. There's no obvious point to make that the political history and context between the two countries is vastly different. That's the most obvious point to make. But also one interesting tidbit of information about the Dutch politics is that Dutch voters are notoriously disloyal. They switch party allegiance very easily. So very well-known research has been done on this. There's no deep loyalty left in Dutch politics. They switch allegiance very quickly. Now, of course, that works differently in our context. So all of that plays into how coalition politics works out. A few comments about the role of the law. I think one of the things that we've learned throughout our work at the Institute on coalitions is that the answer does not lie in law, in regulation, in institutionalizing. I think the point has been made, and I completely agree with that. There are a few things that we can look at, very minimalistic. For example, the time period for forming a government. 2 weeks is too short. I think everyone kind of agrees 2 weeks really is too short. In local government, it's 2 weeks, it's too short, and certainly for national government, 2 weeks is too short. So I think that's something, and that's going to require a constitutional amendment, because those 14 days are written into our constitution. And I think we need a bit of a longer time, but not the blanket position that leads to negotiations that can last forever and a day, like in the Netherlands, but maybe something like a month or 3 weeks or something to that effect, but 2 weeks is too short. And we do have a provision in the Constitution that says that until the next president is elected, cabinet remains in office. So we're not looking at a vacuum or at a period of a month or 2 months where there is no government. No, our Constitution does make provision for that. We need to have the debate about thresholds. Do we want to force the defragmentation of our politics through the imposition of an electoral threshold, where you need to have obtained 1% or a certain percentage of the vote before you can enter a legislature or a council? And that's going to be a tough discussion, because the absence of a threshold was very hotly debated in our constitutional negotiations. It was deliberately chosen to not have an electoral threshold, to do away with the past of the winner takes all, and to allow a diversity of voices in legislatures. Is it time to revisit that? Also, smaller issues, for example, is it wise to have in our constitution that our Speaker of Parliament and provincial legislatures and the Premier and the President are voted by secret ballot? Does that help coalitions? Or does it give room for backroom dealings, buying of votes? And here is the role of the public. Are we, as the public, as the voters, are we entitled to see how the votes pan out, in terms of the party that I voted for, what that party does with my vote when it comes to exercising coalition decisions? So that for me would be an issue that links directly to the topic of this panel. I'm not in favor of regulating motions of no confidence, limiting the scope or the time of when a councillor or a member of parliament may table a motion of no confidence. I think if we start limiting that, we're going to have all kinds of unintended consequences. One municipal manager explained it to me like this when we did research on this. He said, coalitions are not formed inside the council. They are formed outside of the council. When people come together and decide, the two of us or the three of us, we now have a majority and we're going to unseat the existing majority. They report to council to table a motion of no confidence in the mayor, and then they get told you can't because there's a rule that you can't. That doesn't make a difference to them. They still have the majority politically. So that's going to cause all kinds of problems in governance and in the administration, because they will tell the existing mayor, your time is up. You may be in office still, but remember, we actually have the majority. They will start blocking decisions, blocking the budget. So I think limiting motions of no confidence is not the way to go. I also think that having rules to somehow make coalition agreements enforceable or binding, I think that's not feasible. It's unconstitutional. I don't think you can have a contract in place between political parties that somehow binds a member of parliament or a councillor to vote in a particular way. That's not what we expect of our political representatives. We want them to vote according to their conscience and according to their party mandate, if so be it, but not according to a contract. So those are the legal issues, and I think for the rest, it's really about developing that political culture, those conventions and the habits or traditions that we spoke about earlier. I do think that said earlier, we need coalition agreements that say a bit more than the high-level principles that really nobody can disagree with. It needs to say a little bit more. For example, the fact that we ran into almost a crisis, or it was a crisis around the budget, whether or not to increase taxes, that is something that should have been negotiated out right at the beginning, because that will be question number one on the list of questions. Are we going to raise taxes, yes or no? That is something that should have been negotiated out. So I think that's something we can learn for the future, but we need to then look at the time period, because you cannot really arrive at something more than a statement of intent when you only have two weeks. I think part of the habits and traditions that we need to develop in terms of practicing coalitions is also that when coalitions are formed, hopefully in a slightly with slightly less time pressure than currently, that there is regular feedback to the public. Of course, coalition negotiations cannot take place in public. It's not a public affair. It will be done behind closed doors. But you need to give regular feedback to the public on where you are at and what are the sticking points and how close you are to a conclusion. Last point I want to make is that many of these issues play themselves out fundamentally differently in national provincial government compared to local government. The crisis in local government around coalition politics is serious. It's because the local government scenario is unforgiving. One city manager told me that when I have problems in my coalition, the next day the trucks don't leave the depot. So it's unforgiving. And that's not the same in national provincial government. When there's coalition turmoil, it takes a while before it results in service delivery problems. But in local government, the atmosphere is unforgiving, and we need to look quite seriously at how to do better at coalition politics and management at local government level. Thank you, Chair.
Been here, I'm not going to summarize after each speaker, but I just think this idea of information sharing and that feedback loop to citizens is something critical to take away.
Cool, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. My contribution is going to be sort of a collation of ideas put together as a result of research I've done for over a number of years, both in terms of what I've written about coalitions and dissertations that I've supervised. So they've gone through tiers and more changes and more tiers and so there are a few kind of conclusions I think that I can that I thought stand out in terms of this experience. I think the first thing I want to say with regard to this, and given that this is a session that's dealing with public engagement, is that I found that there is a discrepancy between the actual realities of coalition politics and public perceptions of coalition politics. I think that's the first thing that I've seen, and that the two don't at times see eye to eye, right? And I'll explain a bit more about this a bit later. And I think that the kind of central questions that I've dealt with regard to coalition questions, I suppose as a researcher, as a teacher, as a supervisor, etc., are not questions about turmoil, because as a political scientist, I assume that there will be turmoil. That's going to happen, right? I assume that there will be conflict. I assume that people are going to fight, and that there's going to be crises, and and all that. Like that's a given in my world. So the question that we look at are the factors that account for the survivability of coalitions, meaning how do they survive, and why and how do they fall apart. And a lot of the research I've done what I've got here are just my small conclusions about the South African experience since 1994, I think. And I have about about 6 points that I'll be brief, though. No, I won't go into them in much. And the first one is that I think that firstly, we found that coalition survivability has largely been determined by the characteristics of cabinets, right? Meaning what coalition cabinets look like. They've been determined by the party distribution in the legislature. But most importantly, in addition to these, but most importantly though, have been the extent to which parties have approached their coalition condition. So it's how they approach it, right? The second thing, and I think that it does sort of flow from this, is that contrary to expectations, the ideological differences between parties, and if we are to operationalize them on like a classic left-right kind of situation, have not had a significant bearing on survivability. They haven't had. And that's something that's quite interesting, because the public perception is that they do have a bearing on it. The third thing, and I think that this is a question that was raised, I think, by a person online on what type of coalitions we have, and I think that in terms of the research that we do, we sort of delve into this though. So we look at different types of coalitions, how they're configured, and we call them, right? So most coalitions in this country have been what we call minimal winning coalitions, right? And these are kind of those coalitions that just require those parties to make 51%. And this we've seen across, municipalities, whether it's Western Cape, Northern Cape, Northwest, whatever, Bofada and all these places, right? But what we have at the GNU is something that is rare in terms of our experience, which is what we call a surplus majority coalition, right? And that is a distinctive type with its own logic. And we can maybe talk about why it is that they approach it this way. And that explains, I think, why they even called it a GNU, I think, that maybe we didn't talk about before. The sort of like fourth point we reach is that we've seen that parties are able to rise above ideological differences, but this is not necessarily to do with noble intentions. I think it has more to do with opportunism than that. So we find that opportunism and pragmatism is what drives parties to rise above these differences, as opposed to what maybe some people would think are, maturity and all these things, right? And the fifth point is that, coalitions at one level will often have negative implications for party relations across levels, which means that, therefore, at the heart of coalitions is less about the party per se, but the individual agents who drive them and who, or the kind of lenses through which they approach the coalition, what they're trying to solve in their context, right? And we see this with, GNU, for example. They're trying to solve a problem of national parliament that may not make sense for people in, say, Gauteng, etc. And so I think that the role of agency, I think, is very, very key. And so I think that what we've seen is that public perceptions are often at odds with these, in the sense that, most of our research has revealed, and I think that you did mention this, is that the level of trust, not only in Parliament, by the way, but in the level of political parties in this country is extremely low. And I think that that level of trust in parties is declining. We don't see an increase with in that. And I think that there's a general perception that the party system is polarized and that parties have incompatible interests and incompatible preferences. But obviously, if we look at this as a matter of empirical observation, what we find is that the party system is in fact more moderate in character, and that we do have a lot more consensus building, which means that when the public observes all of these differences, they are more about trying to pursue narrowly defined interests as opposed to people really disagreeing. Let's keep the ANC out at all costs. And then you have an EFF-DA relationship. And then in the next election, the DA says the EFF is a doomsday coalition. It's like, well, then why did you, agree to do something with these guys in one election, but then in another one you say, well, these people are, they have horns and all these things, right? And so there is this kind of contradiction, I think, that points out to how parties firstly pursue their interests, but the most importantly is that ideological polarization is more theater than it is real, right? And I will get a bit controversial here, So even things like BEE and land reform, etc. If one actually looks at it quite carefully, you will see that actually it's not that land reform is not important, right? But the way in which it is articulated is more theater than it is real, right? Anyway, we can maybe talk about this. How much time do I have? 1 more minute. Oh, gosh. 5 seconds. So, okay. Oh, hang on a second. Anyway, so I mean, like, yeah. So maybe just to conclude that is therefore in terms of how we engage, is that there is a mistrust in coalitions. I think that the kind of automatic answer is, how can you have DA and ANC work together? That's the kind of automatic answer you see, and what fuels this are the different ways in which party leaders express these opinions. But then again, I think that this is more theater, I think, than more reality. I'll stop. I'm talking.
Thank you very much. I'm hopefully going to be brief in these remarks because a lot has been said already. So I think looking at it from a citizen, voter, civil society perspective, my starting point is that the very fact that we have a coalition government at national level is the choice of the voters. They put us into this predicament. Parties have not come up with this notion that we're going to create a coalition government. As voters, we told them that that's what they must do. So that's my starting point. The voters have spoken. But which of those voters have spoken? Because my huge concern, and it has to be brought into this conversation, is the low level of voter participation in elections, which has been steadily declining over the years, and in particular in recent elections, and in particular there's a lower turnout in local government elections than there are at national and provincial elections. So just to use 2024 as an example, the registration rate is only 65%. So only 65% of people who are eligible to vote are actually registered. That's shocking. That's more than 10 million people who are not registered. The turnout at the election was 58.6% of those registered voters. If you look at what I would refer to as the overall turnout, based on eligible voters, it was 38.1%. So less than 1 in 4 people voted. That's going to be a huge concern for all of us in terms of the legitimacy, not just of coalitions, but of our democratic project as a whole. But for me, those are really sobering numbers and should really focus our minds. So we have declining levels of voter registration and turnout, and one doesn't want to get into the detail of this, but what is particularly concerning is that it's particularly prevalent amongst young people, the 18 to 29-year-old voting group. So we have in our politics now far more political parties, but seemingly fewer voters. And then my other next point is around, and this has been touched on already, is about the lack of public information about the coalitions. Is again, this bringing it back to, as voters, we've commanded the situation that you need to enter into a coalition if you're going to govern. And beyond the statement of intent, we have nothing, absolutely nothing. There's may point to the medium-term development framework, which is government's program of action, but that doesn't really speak to the issues of the coalition and what has been hammered out there. Even when we look at the issues around the clearinghouse and the rules for the clearinghouse, Jaap, you can help us here. Those have not been published. They've not been shared with us. How does this mechanism work? A lot of people have said, well, it isn't working. Well, we don't know what it is, so we don't know why it's not working, if it's not working. So it's that kind of level of responsibility that I think political parties have to the electorate to provide that. I was very interested in what Prof said earlier about the consultations that are happening in the Netherlands with civil society organizations, the labor movements and so on. fascinating that none of that is done here. We've been trying for a year now to have a national dialogue. We failed. So how are you going to have those consultations in 100 days? I have no idea. But it's something we need to look at. And then just, I'm not going to repeat, Marianne's already touched on this, some of the stuff from the Afrobarometer survey. There's, the last survey, 70% of people are dissatisfied with democracy. Almost 50% of people are saying, well, we'll happily accept a military government rather than a democratic one. And that's the sort of state of our democracy right now. And then in the same vein, 40% of people think that the GNU has been effective, and another 40% think it hasn't. So there are differing perceptions of how good this has been. And will there be, in the next election, maybe because of the different set of dynamics that play out at a local level, may not happen this year, but will there be a sense of buyer's remorse in 2029? We asked them to we didn't give any party a majority, and will voters now rethink that choice? That's a question that's open. My final point is really around, what does this all mean for the role of Parliament as an institution? And especially in the context of, and I love this term as well, of the surplus majority coalition, because it's 10 political parties, but it's 72% of the seats in Parliament. So where is the opposition in Parliament? It's literally 28%. Now we saw last year with the budget crisis how effective Parliament can be. But that was probably an isolated example of where you're going to get parties inside and outside of the GNU collaborating against each other. What does it really say about the role of Parliament, and how effective is Parliament? I mean, we've seen some positive changes in Parliament, in the new Parliament, since the 24 elections. You've got, for example, opposition parties and other parties chairing key committees in Parliament. So one of the so-called coalition partners, although not in the National Executive, Rise Mzansi, chairing the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, an important committee. Beyond that, is the culture of accountability and oversight in Parliament going to change when you've got such a lopsided coalition majority in that institution? And then I think, from a electoral civil society perspective, points have been made already, is that, given the short time frames of putting together agreements, they're very high level, such as the statement of intent, the time frames force the transactional nature of coalition discussions about allocation of positions rather than focus on policy perspectives. And the danger here is that further alienates the voting public in terms of confidence and legitimacy in these arrangements. So I think let me stop there with just those thoughts for now.
So on the issue of the role of the public, I do want to make maybe it's not a nice point to make, not a popular point to make, but in the end, coalition making is inevitably going to be somewhat of an elite deal. It is about politicians getting together and concluding a deal. They will not do that process of the conclusion of a deal in a very transparent, participatory manner. And that's not what we're expecting. Because that will be impossible. You can't negotiate a coalition agreement in public. In fact, we've seen how disastrous it can be when leaders of political parties here started airing the dirty laundry in public. There was a phase in the GNU where we had one press conference after another, and Fikile Mbalula doing his thing, and then Helen Zille doing a thing. It was unseemly. And it stopped because I think they realized this is not how you negotiate through press conferences. But the corollary to that argument is that the government in South Africa, whether it is led by a coalition or not, has a duty to consult the public. We have a constitutional principle of participatory democracy. That applies irrespective of how your politics is configured. So sometimes I do think we need to make that distinction, because when voters lose trust in government, I think that's a general problem that should not just be placed at the door of coalitions. All of the above. Yeah, that's it's a cop out, but it is all of the above. But I do think that, and this is the point I tried to make earlier, that when you talk about habits and conventions, for example, when the Dutch form a coalition, it is that very long time period, and every day there is a brief moment with the press, where the person who's charged with forming the coalition needs to give a bit of feedback to the press, and of course it's very limited, but there is this thing of regular feedback, and that we don't have here in South Africa yet.
Two questions. The one is basically on the role of the courts being used as dispute resolution mechanisms in the GNU. Does the panel anticipate some sort of GNU jurisprudence in the future? And maybe is there a possibility to develop better dispute mechanisms so it doesn't go into the legal system? And then a second question is just in response to the question of voter turnout, why there is such low voter turnout amongst young voters in particular was another question that came up. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. Without wanting to get into too much of that detail, I think some of the studies that have been done have shown a direct link between levels of unemployment, in particular youth unemployment, and the levels of youth non-registration with the IEC. So there's probably a correlation in that regard when it comes to, because those are the people that are on the margins of society who, whether it's coalition government or any other government, has simply not delivered for them. So the desire to go and register, let alone the desire to vote, is simply not there. I think it would be a really dangerous thing if the courts were to become involved in GNU. I think Jaap made the point earlier, and others have as well. I mean, yes, we want a coalition agreement, but nobody's saying that it must be a legally enforceable agreement. It's simply there to legitimize the program of the coalition government, to keep the public informed of what is happening. But if we start litigating around issues of what's happening inside a coalition arrangement, because judges are not equipped to make what are fundamentally political decisions. There's very rarely that a legal issue is at stake. It's a political issue, but we're asking the courts to adjudicate what is fundamentally a political decision. And we've seen it happen a lot in our jurisprudence already, and not always very well. So I would caution against that.
Thanks. I completely agree with that. And I can maybe say a little bit about the clearinghouse mechanism protocol that was adopted by the GNU as a dispute resolution mechanism. I played some part in the preparation of it. So it's basically a document which is not a legally binding document because it cannot be. It's basically just a piece of paper that sets out how the political parties in the GNU will go about dealing with their disputes. It gets referred to so when there's disagreement in cabinet, at some point the president may decide, okay, we're not resolving this, so let's park it with the deputy president, who is then going to lead a process in the clearinghouse mechanism to bring the various parties together and go through a process of basically talking and talking and talking until they hopefully come to some sort of resolution. One issue that I insisted on when I played a role in drafting it is that we need to have a clause in there, I call it the agree to disagree clause, that it is okay to come to the conclusion that you won't agree. For example, let's say on the issue of Gaza, that the DA and the ANC will come to a formal position, say, okay, we don't agree on this. We have differing positions. But guess what? It does not have to mean that this government is going to collapse, because we also have to govern the country. So let's formally record our disagreement. Everyone will understand. The DA can go to its own constituency and say, this is our position. So can the ANC and other parties. Constituents understand it, and it doesn't collapse the government. And it's interesting, again, a bit of comparative research, and there's one, I think it was the Danish, that actually have a rule that that kind of agree to disagree principle can also translate into a cabinet resolution. So of course you have the unity of cabinet. You cannot, it's not, you don't, there's consensus, almost forced consensus in cabinet. But when you have a fundamental disagreement within the coalition, one of the parties can make a note to a cabinet resolution to say, okay, we abide by this resolution, we're part of it, we're part of cabinet, we're part of the coalition, but we do note our disagreement. So it's one very pragmatic way of giving sort of an exit, like a escape valve to the pressure of that kind of disagreement. And I think those are the kind of practical solutions that we need to look towards, and indeed not towards the courts. That will be a very undesirable situation.
Thanks, Swedi. Well, are there any questions coming from the audience? I see you, Suzanne.
Thank you. Thanks. Please can I ask the legal minds in the panel, and just political minds too. What's your sense whether there's a willingness and appetite among current parliamentary members, they will be in power for quite another few years, to change the constitution, to refine the constitution, to make better provision for coalition politics, for the coalition realities. And maybe you can also reflect on the prospects for advancing the current legislation that is in draft form, but so far is not going anywhere fast. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been grappling with this notion that voters have chosen a coalition. And I'm not so sure how to really problematize it, but there's something that doesn't quite sit well with me there, because it's concluding that by not choosing, they have chosen, right? And just listening to the conversation about the trade-offs and the negotiation towards a coalition, and how the different parties are concerned about maintaining their base, and you couple that with the fact that Lawson, you speak about the levels of voter apathy, that actually less than 30% of people who are eligible to vote are actually participating in making this choice. So you have on one hand a coalition which is made of parties that are not even you know, if you want to expand the definition of electoral legitimacy, they don't quite meet that threshold. And then second, to then say, you know, this is what people have chosen. And I'm just wondering how that may influence our framing on what is it that should be considered as effective management of a coalition when we do not think of the fact that voters are not agreed. That's number one. Number two, that actually the majority of people who should be voting have not voted. So I think there's something to be said about equating an electoral outcome, number one, that lacks, you know, broader legitimacy, and then number two, which is simply a default outcome by the fact that people are not quite decided as representing what South Africans have chosen. Because I think it can be quite a way of oversimplifying things that may not be as useful when we want to think of legitimacy of the coalition government. So yeah, it's a problem in my head that I think you know, maybe needs to be crystallized better. But there's something there of a bit of a disjuncture. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciating that the context of the previous GNU, the 1994-96 one, and this one is completely different. I just want to understand from a principled position. There we had a binding document in the form of the interim constitution, and now we're saying that here a binding document is not that necessary. There we established the Constitutional Court, particularly to ensure that parties, when crafting the Constitution, don't deviate from the agreements in the interim Constitution. Now we are saying, no, that is not the place of the court. There, the process was completely transparent. We had the media covering it. We had people having access to the negotiations process. Now we're saying that negotiations of coalitions, because of their nature, has to have some element of secrecy. So it would be good to hear from your perspective, from a principled position, why the two elements are different. Thank you.
Great. So I'm now going to let each of our speakers just respond to the three questions or conundrums and which were coming from the floor. And I won't stop you. I will let you hand on the talking stick to your next panel.
Okay, I'll be brief. I'm aware of the time. I think, you know, the question on Parliament, I'm very skeptical about the role and the power of Parliament at the moment to be able to think through reform in general, right? Irrespective of what the reform is, maybe, but more specifically constitutional amendments and how to think through those things. I'm very, very skeptical about them, and I say that because if we look at the characteristics of Parliament in the last, say, 10 to 15 years or so, even say 20 years, there's been a high turnover of members of Parliament, right? And the problem with high turnovers is that Parliament then loses its institutional memory, right? So every year you've got new people, they're young, they don't know what happened, you know, the last time, they're clueless, etc. And for them it's about the theater of it, and then it's the next election, and then you're out. Or maybe you are then on, you know, YouTube and Instagram and all these things, right? And I don't think that structural condition provides for a healthy Parliament, irrespective of the party distribution. that is able to think through the kind of reforms, that maybe you talk about, or even other reforms, in fact, that are much needed, I think, whether it's in law reform and police and all these things. So I don't think that Parliament can perform that role, even though maybe in theory some people may think it should, but I don't think that they're in the right condition, and at the same time I'm not sure whether unless there's a level of stabilization in the party distribution over, say, a 10 or 15-year period. So now we're looking at 2030, 38. And we say these people who are in now, a substantial amount of them have gained the experience, have gained the knowledge. But at this rate, every year it's, you have to do, induction and more Instagram and more selfies, and then it's the next election. And then you're done, right? So I don't think that's the thing. The gentleman who talked about the conundrum, I don't know about the conundrum. I don't think it is one, though, because I think that all the coalitions that we're talking about here are simply coalitions that come out of a hung parliament, right? Which means that no one really gets a 51%. Now, what do we call that, right? We can call it, this is what the voters want, because this is, these are, and I think that the meaning behind that, in my view, is that, these are how the cards, or these are the ways in which the cards are laid at the moment, and we have to make sense of it. So I don't think that it is a saying that says voters went to the voting station to say, we demand a coalition. It's more to say, actually, the electoral outcome is representative of fragmented electoral choice. I think that's what it is, but maybe I could not be answering you right. I think it's one thing. And then I think that maybe to try and take a stab at your question, I think that we must be careful in how we think about GNU coalitions under a specific context, I think, because the GNU in the 1990s was part of a journey, right? That began with, Grooteskieur, then it went on to, DF Malan Accord, Pretoria Minute, then it went on to all of those things, and then the Interconstitution, and then, so it was part of that journey. Whereas I think that when we're looking at, what they call the GNU now, this is more, I think, to do with us accepting the reality that we are a functioning democracy. And in a functioning democracy, sometimes we're going to have inconclusive electoral outcomes. Whereas the other one, I think that it is about, how do we think through post-conflict political reconstruction? I think that was a GNU then, and so therefore the principles invariably are going to be different. How you negotiate is going to be different. Things can blow up the next day, whereas I think that now we're in a very, very different context, and one where, the stakes are not as high as we maybe make them out to be.
Thanks. I agree with that with that very much. By the way, I don't like the term hung parliament or hung council. It's a Westminster thing. It's something we've taken over from the British, as if something went wrong. Oh, council is hung. Something went wrong. No, that's a consequence of our electoral system. Our electoral system is not designed to produce a majority. So if society is a scrambled egg, so will the council, and that's not a hung. So I think we need to do something about that term, but it's very persistent in our conversation sometimes. To change the constitution, you need a 2/3 majority in 6 out of the 9 provinces, so it's a tall order, because there is no majority, not even a simple majority. So I think the appetite for changing the constitution is low, and it's a tall order. I don't think we need a lot of constitutional change, because we don't need to solve coalitions through law. But this 14-day issue, I think, but I mean, I really get a sense that there's broad agreement across all political parties that 14 days can be lengthened. But as soon as you start talking about, for example, abolishing the secret ballot, I think there's already going to be lots of pushback, and we may not even get a majority on that, let alone the issue of thresholds. So if it's just limited to the 14-day, I think it's feasible. The current laws that are before Parliament dealing with local government, which are not constitutional amendments but normal statutory amendments, I'm not even sure how far they will go, because they propose a threshold, as you know. There's two proposals, a 1% threshold and a slightly softer threshold. There's a lot of pushback against that from obviously the smaller parties, slightly arguing from within their own interest, because they will disappear with that 1% threshold, some of them. What's very interesting, two issues on that, is that you've now seen an initiative between 4 small political parties starting to work together. BOSA, Rise Mzansi, Action SA and Good. They have now signed some sort of pact that they're going to collaborate, because they see a threshold coming. That once a threshold enters the law, they're all in jeopardy. So, and maybe that's a good thing. If a threshold forces political parties to work together, that can be a positive outcome of the introduction of a threshold. Quite interestingly, just last week in the Dutch Parliament, which doesn't have a threshold, Holland doesn't have a special threshold, the majority in Parliament voted against the introduction of a threshold, because it was in the new government, the incoming government sort of program to introduce a threshold, and they voted against it. And the argument was, it is not the smallest parties that are the problem. They are not the ones who make coalitions unstable. It is the mid-sized parties that constantly blow up coalitions. It's usually the smallest parties that help them over the edge. So there's some truth to that, maybe also in South Africa. On the last question of, I think I agree with very much with how Prof. Jalobe answered it. For me, the big difference would be that process of transparency, consultation around the interim constitution was because we were drafting a constitution about Bill of Rights, TRC, structure of the state. That for me is different from we are entering into a political agreement about whether or not to raise taxes or what our foreign policy should be. That for me is a different scenario. So that for me would be an important difference between the two scenarios. Thanks.
Thanks. Not much to add, because you've both covered it very well. I mean, just on agree with you, Jaap, on the point of constitutional amendments. I think the time period for the election of the president at national level and also the provisions at local level need to be relooked at. But it's difficult, because we can sit here and say, well, 14 days is too short, but is 30 days enough? It may be, it may not be. And you don't want to change the constitution in a way that makes it 30 days and you suddenly 10 years down the line, 30 days is not enough, and then you know. So I think it needs to be thought through, but I think we, with the experience, we're going to have to address some of those things, including some of the more tricky ones that Jaap mentioned earlier. But I think the point, Showers, is, this is part of our new reality now. And I think that, that's maybe where your conundrum is coming from, is, this is something we're going to have to live with, and it's something that we're going to have to learn to live with. And it may be that there are going to be some changes in terms of the framework, including the issue, Suzanne, on electoral reform, and not just the introduction of thresholds, but also more fundamental electoral reform. Because one of the things is the current system, yes, it promotes diversity and inclusivity, but it's led to a fragmentation of our politics with, a splintering of political parties. And if we move towards some sort of meaningful electoral reform in terms of some hybrid or mixed system between constituency-based and PR-elected representation, we may see less of that fragmentation, we may see less political parties, We're still likely to see coalitions, but perhaps they will be more stable.
Great, so it's just up to me to thank the three speakers, and I do believe that the stakes are really high, which is why I'm so grateful for this conversation. I've learned an enormous amount from this panel, and as our guest speaker from the Netherlands said, something about we need to practice, right? It's about practicing coalition politics and a new reality, and we'll figure it out as we always do in our messy, complex, and uniquely South African way. So thanks, speakers. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you to the speakers, to the facilitator, and thank you for your patience. It's been a very, very interesting day. I think we've all learned so much, and I thank you all for sharing generously your insights and engaging around this important topic. I'm not going to try to do a summary of such rich panel discussions, but I know that we all have food for thought, things to take away and think about, things to take away and perhaps do if we have the agency, things to take away and research if we are researchers, and I'm sure we'll all be doing exactly that as we go to our separate spaces. So it's left for me to really thank the panelists and facilitators, to thank my co-hosts, the Netherlands Embassy, the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, to thank Professor Koenders, who really has been so generous with his time over the past few days, sharing his insight, also with political parties that we somehow managed to persuade to sit around the table and talk about these issues, and find quite, hearteningly that they are willing to engage in the very debates that we are engaging in today. To thank this wonderful Graduate School of Business for the excellent facilities, and to thank 2807 and its partners in the media space for helping us to put this together. It wasn't easy always because we are based in Johannesburg, but I can assure you we'd like to come back to Cape Town for events in future. To thank my other MISTRA colleagues, and before we close, and I would like to invite the ambassador up after the ambassador has spoken, regard the proceedings as closed, and to, from my side, just to wish you well as you travel to your respective spaces. Ambassador.
I think I did not prepare, but no, thank you so much for sticking around. And we are very pleased, thank you so much, MISTRA. I mean, this was an idea that came up a couple of months ago to see how we could answer that call from, okay, share your experiences, and to see how we could make it engaging and see what we could get out of it to hear the voices. And indeed, we had a very interesting closed session with the political parties. And for me, it's a very honest discussion. It's really looking for ways how to take it forward. And it's really a democratic process. And I learned a lot, also about my own country. So, but also to hear and to see how things are developing here, and that every country has its own way of dealing with it. So, no, thank you so much. And thank you indeed also the school here for hosting us. And thank you all for sticking around. And I mean, we are looking forward to see how next. So indeed the prof is excusing himself. He had to go, but he was interested also to see how we can take it further. But thanks again for all the people who made this possible. Thank you.